in the heart of Dream Zanarkand, where crystalline towers pierce an eternal twilight, and the ghosts of 1,000 years play out their scripted existence, there stands a boy who does not know he is dreaming. He lives his life beneath stadium lights, surrounded by adoring crowds, believing himself to be Titus, star blitzball player of the Zanarkand Abbess, son of the great Yecht, inheritor of a legacy both proud and poisonous. He does not know that his entire world is a memory given form, a prayer crystallized into false flesh, a dream dreamed by the faith of those who died when the real Zanarkand burned a millennium ago. He does not know that somewhere far beyond his comprehension, in the ruins of what was once the greatest city in Spira, there sits a thing that was once a man, now reduced to nothing but will and malice and an endless, terrible purpose, dreaming him into existence. This is the story of Yu Yevon, the summoner who became a god, the savior who became Spira's eternal curse, the man who loved his city so completely that he condemned an entire world to cycles of death and false hope for 1,000 years. It is a story of summoning and sin, of faith weaponized and love transformed into horror, of how the greatest acts of devotion can become the deepest forms of damnation. To understand sin, to understand the pilgrimage that defines Spira's existence, to understand why hope itself became a heresy, we must understand the man who set this terrible wheel in motion, the summoner whose final act of desperation echoes still through every prayer, every eon, every spiral of death that has defined a world. But how did Yu Yevon come to this? What choices, what losses, what acts of love or madness led a man to transcend humanity itself and become a living apocalypse? What could drive someone to create a weapon so terrible that it would outlive empires, destroy civilizations, and reduce the world to scattered islands connected only by fear? To answer these questions, we must journey back to a Spira that no longer exists, to a time when Machina towers scraped the heavens and cities blazed with electric light, to an age of pride and power that the modern world remembers only as a cautionary tale, a golden age that ended not with a whimper, but with fire that fell from the sky and a summoner's desperate, world-breaking final spell. Our story begins not in the ruins of Zanarkand, but in its glory, when the city stood proud as the jewel of civilization, when its summoners were revered not as pilgrims walking toward certain death, but as artists, as scholars, as the pinnacle of human achievement and spiritual communion with the faith. 1,000 years before Titus would play his final game of blitzball, before Yuna would walk the pilgrim's path, before the temples of Yevon would spread their doctrine of atonement and suffering across a broken world, Spira existed in a state that modern minds can barely comprehend. The world that Yu Yevon knew was not a collection of isolated islands connected by perilous ocean crossings and the thin threads of pilgrimage routes, but a thriving, interconnected civilization where Machina did the work of hundreds, where airships crossed continents in hours, where the very landscape hummed with the power of technology so advanced it would seem like magic to those who came after. Bivel stood as the seat of military and political power, its fortress temples already ancient even then, its priests and soldiers wielding authority backed by Machina weapons that could level mountains. The city-state had built its empire on the strength of its war machines, on the cold efficiency of its military doctrine, on the belief that power and order were synonymous, that control over the physical world through technology was the highest form of civilization. In Bivel's grand halls, Machina were not seen as tools that might anger the gods or upset some cosmic balance, but as humanity's rightful dominion over nature, as proof that mankind had evolved beyond the limitations of flesh and faith, that the future belonged to those who could harness lightning and bend metal to their will. And yet, for all of Bevel's military might, for all its Machina legions and fortress walls, it was Zanarkand that held Spira's heart. Where Bevel commanded through force, Zanarkand inspired through beauty. Where Bevel's Machina were weapons of war, Zanarkand's technology served art, culture, and the refinement of the human spirit. The city rose from the northern reaches of Spira like a crown of crystal and light, its architecture a marriage of aesthetic vision and technological achievement that made even Bevel's grandest structures seem crude by comparison. Towers of glass and polished metal spiraled upward, catching the sun and refracting it into rainbow cascades that painted the streets below in ever-shifting color. Water features flowed not through simple channels, but in defiance of gravity itself, streams that curved upward and sideways, forming liquid sculptures that hung in the air through Machina manipulation of natural forces. At the heart of this magnificent city stood the great Blitzball Stadium, a sphere of transparent material that seemed to hold an entire ocean suspended in mid-air, where athletes performed their art beneath the watching eyes of thousands. Blitzball in that age was not merely a game, but a sacred expression of Zanarkand's philosophy, that grace and skill, when perfected, became a form of prayer, that the human body in motion could achieve something approaching the divine. The players were celebrities and artists, their matches attended by citizens who dressed in finery that would make modern nobility seem shabby, who watched not just for entertainment, but for transcendence, for those moments when athleticism became poetry and competition became communion. But it was summoning for which Zanarkand was most renowned, and in this the city had no equal, not even in Bevel's fortress temples where priests commanded eons in battle. Zanarkand's summoners were not warriors, but scholars, mystics, artists of the spiritual realm, who spent decades mastering the delicate communion between human consciousness and the faith. The Fayth themselves, willing souls who had chosen to seal their spirits in statues to serve as bridges between the mortal and divine, were treated with reverence bordering on worship. To become Fayth in Zanarkand was the highest honor, a sacrifice made not in desperation or duty, but in the belief that one's spirit could become part of something greater, that in giving up individual existence, one could achieve a form of immortality through service to the eons. The summoner's art in Zanarkand was nothing like the grim pilgrimage that would define later ages. These summoners did not walk roads towards certain death, did not carry the weight of the world's sins on their shoulders, did not sacrifice themselves to buy Spira a handful of peaceful years. Instead, they studied in great academies where the walls were lined with texts both ancient and cutting edge, where the relationship between human will and aeonic power was analyzed with scientific rigor and spiritual depth. A summoner's training might span 30 years or more, decades of meditation and study, of learning to quiet the ego enough to make room for the vast consciousness of an aeon, of understanding the delicate balance between command and cooperation, between wielding power and being wielded by it. When a Zanarkand summoner called forth an aeon, it was performance as much as power, art as much as invocation. The aeons that manifested were not mere weapons, but partners, entities whose appearance and abilities reflected not just their own nature, but the summoner's understanding, personality, and spiritual evolution. Some summoners specialized in the subtle arts, calling forth aeons of healing and protection, while others manifested beings of terrible beauty, whose power was balanced by the summoner's careful control. The displays of summoning were public events, attended by crowds who appreciated the nuance of the communion, who could distinguish between a technically proficient summoning and one that achieved true spiritual synchrony, who understood that they were witnessing something that existed at the intersection of human achievement and divine mystery. It was into this world of art and power, of spiritual refinement and technological achievement, that Yu Yevon was born. The historical records that survive, fragments preserved in spheres that endured the apocalypse, whispered stories passed down through generations of faith, memories embedded in the very stones of ruined temples, tell us little of his early life. We do not know the names of his parents, whether he came from one of Zanarkand's noble families or rose from more humble origins. What we do know is that he displayed an affinity for summoning so profound that it was recognized even in childhood, that he entered the Summoner's Academy at an age when most children were still learning basic letters, that his progression through the ranks of Zanarkand's spiritual elite was meteoric even by the standards of a city that produced the world's greatest summoners. By the time Yu Yevon reached his maturity, he had already achieved what most summoners spent lifetimes pursuing: a perfect communion with multiple aeons, an understanding of the faith that bordered on the instinctive, an ability to maintain summons for hours where others managed minutes. More than his technical skill, though, it was his philosophy that set him apart. Where other summoners saw the aeons as partners or tools, Yu Yevon understood them as something deeper, as manifestations of collective human will and faith, as proof that consciousness could transcend the limitations of individual existence, as bridges not just between mortal and divine, but between past and future, between the individual and the eternal. His rise to prominence coincided with a period of increasing tension between Zanarkand and Bevel, a Cold War that had simmered for decades and was beginning to boil over into open conflict. The philosophical differences between the two great powers had always existed. Bevel's belief in order through force versus Zanarkand's pursuit of beauty through refinement, military discipline versus artistic expression, the power of Machina weapons versus the grace of eons. But differences in philosophy need not lead to war, and for generations, the two cities had coexisted in a state of competitive but generally peaceful rivalry, each pursuing its vision of civilization's highest achievement without directly threatening the other. What changed was Bevel's growing ambition, fueled by advances in Machina weaponry that made its military might seem unchallengeable. Bevel's leaders began to envision not just a strong city-state, but an empire, a unified Spira brought under Bevelian control, ordered and disciplined according to Bevelian principles. To the fortress city's ruling class, Zanarkand's cultural influence was not merely different, but dangerous. Its emphasis on individual artistic expression threatened Bevel's social order. Its spiritual approach to summoning seemed primitive compared to Bevel's more pragmatic weaponization of eons, and its very existence as an alternative model of civilization represented a challenge to Bevel's claim that military power and social control were the only paths to security and prosperity. The first open hostilities were skirmishes, conflicts that both sides could dismiss as border disputes or the actions of rogue elements. But these gave way to more organized confrontations, battles where Bevel's Machina armies clashed with Zanarkand's summoner soldiers and their eons. The early engagements seemed to favor neither side decisively. Bevel's Machina could devastate conventional forces, but Zanarkand's summoners proved adept at countering technological superiority with spiritual power, calling forth eons that could withstand Machina fire and strike back with elemental fury that no armor could fully resist. Yu Yevon, by this time, had risen to a position of tremendous authority in Zanarkand's defense. He was not a general in the traditional sense. Zanarkand's culture had no real tradition of military hierarchy, but rather something more fluid and more powerful. A spiritual leader whose communion with the eons was so profound that other summoners looked to him for guidance, whose strategic insights were respected because they came not from military training, but from his deep understanding of how faith and will could be marshaled into power. When he spoke of defending Zanarkand, he spoke not in terms of territory or political supremacy, but of preserving a way of life, of protecting the conditions that allowed art and spiritual refinement to flourish, of ensuring that humanity's highest achievements would not be crushed beneath the treads of Machina war machines. As the war escalated, Yu Yevon found himself facing an impossible problem that would come to define his existence and reshape the entire world. Bevel's Machina production was effectively unlimited. Factories could churn out weapons faster than Zanarkand's summoners could destroy them, and each summoner lost in battle represented years of training and spiritual development that could never be quickly replaced. The mathematics of attrition were brutally simple. In a prolonged conflict, Bevel's industrial capacity would overwhelm Zanarkand's spiritual prowess. Already, Zanarkand's outlying territories had fallen. Cities that had looked to the great metropolis for cultural leadership, now occupied by Bevelian forces. Their populations brought under the fortress city's control. Their summoner academies closed, or converted to temples that taught Bevel's more militaristic approach to aeonic communion. The evidence of Zanarkand's eventual defeat was visible to anyone willing to see it. Yu Yevon, whose understanding of patterns and probabilities was as sophisticated as his understanding of eons, could project the war's trajectory with terrible clarity. In 5 years, perhaps 10, Bevel's forces would reach Zanarkand itself. The city's walls, however beautiful, were not built to withstand sustained Machina bombardment. The summoners, however skilled, could not be everywhere at once, could not protect every district, every street, every citizen. And when Zanarkand fell, not if, but when, everything it represented would fall with it. The academies would be destroyed or converted. The philosophy of summoning as spiritual art would be replaced by Bevel's weaponized pragmatism. The very idea that civilization could be built on beauty rather than force would be extinguished, remembered only as a failed experiment, a cautionary tale about the naivety of valuing grace over power. This was the crucible in which Yu Yevon's terrible purpose was forged. This was the moment when love for his city, for its culture, and its people, and its philosophy of life, began to transform into something darker, something that would not accept defeat, that would not allow Zanarkand to be merely a footnote in Bevel's triumphant history. In the deepest chambers of Zanarkand's greatest temple, surrounded by Fayth, who had given their individual existence to become bridges to the divine, Yu Yevon began to contemplate possibilities that no summoner had seriously considered before, not because they were beyond the technical capacity of Zanarkand's masters of the art, but because they violated fundamental principles about the relationship between life and death, between individual will and collective power, between the temporary and the eternal. The deeper Yu Yevon delved into the nature of summoning, the more he began to understand that everything Zanarkand's summoners thought they knew about the art was merely the surface of something far more profound and far more dangerous. The relationship between summoner and Fayth, between human will and aeonic manifestation, was not simply a spiritual partnership, but a fundamental manipulation of the boundary between existence and non-existence, between the living and the dead, between individual consciousness and something larger that defied easy categorization. Each time a summoner called forth an eon, they were not merely requesting aid from a divine being, but actively reshaping reality through the focused application of thousands of souls, the Fayth, who had willingly surrendered their individual existence to become part of a collective spiritual engine. In the quiet hours between battle preparations, in the deepest meditation chambers, where even other master summoners rarely ventured, Yu Yevon began to push his communion with the Fayth beyond the traditional boundaries. Where other summoners maintained a respectful distance, treating the Fayth as honored partners whose sacrifice was to be used judiciously and with gratitude, Yu Yevon sought to understand the actual mechanism of their transformation, the precise way that a human soul could be convinced to give up its individuality and become part of an aeonic collective. What he discovered was both beautiful and terrifying, that the Fayth were not simply dead souls given new purpose, but something more complex, consciousnesses that existed in a state between dream and reality, perpetually generating the ions through a form of existence that was neither life nor death, but something that transcended both. The Fayth were dreaming, Yu Yevon realized, but it was a dream of such focus and intensity that it became more real than reality itself. When a summoner called forth an aeon, they were not creating something from nothing, but giving temporary physical form to a dream that was always being dreamed, a vision held in perfect clarity by hundreds or thousands of souls whose individual desires had been subsumed into a single, unified purpose. The aeons were persistent hallucinations, if one could use such crude terminology for something so profound, shared visions so completely believed by their dreamers that they could manifest in the physical world, could interact with matter and energy, could fight and heal and alter the fundamental fabric of existence. This understanding led Yu Yevon to a question that would haunt him and ultimately consume him. If the Fayth could dream aeons into existence, maintaining these impossibly complex forms through the collective power of their focused faith, what else might they dream? Could they dream a building? A city? Could they dream people, not just as empty shells, but as fully realized individuals with memories and personalities and the illusion of independent existence? Could they dream an entire world? The implications were staggering, and they offered a solution to the problem that had seemed unsolvable: how to preserve Zanarkand when its physical destruction was all but inevitable. If the city fell to Bevel's Machina armies, if its towers crumbled and its people were slain or subjugated, if everything that Zanarkand represented in the physical world was erased, could it nonetheless be preserved in a different form? Could the Fayth dream Zanarkand itself, maintaining a perfect copy of the city, not in stone and metal, but in the collective unconscious, in a pocket of reality woven from faith and memory and the desperate need for something beautiful to survive? Yu Yevon began to experiment, carefully at first, with small-scale applications of this theory. He gathered groups of Fayth and asked them to dream not eons, but simpler things: a flower, a fountain, a statue from one of Zanarkand's plazas. The results were inconsistent, but promising. The Fayth could indeed dream physical objects into a form of semi-existence, though maintaining them required constant attention, constant dreaming. The moment the Fayth's focus wavered, the dream objects began to fade, becoming translucent and insubstantial before disappearing entirely. But with sufficient numbers of Fayth, with enough souls united in their vision, the dream objects could be maintained indefinitely, could even be touched and interacted with by those who believed in them strongly enough. Encouraged by these successes, Yu Yevon expanded his experiments, pushing toward more complex dreams, testing the limits of what the Fayth could sustain. He asked them to dream a room from the Summoner's Academy, complete with books and scrolls, with writing implements and meditation cushions, then an entire floor of the Academy, then a section of Zanarkand's residential district, with houses and streets and gardens. Each step required more faith, more coordination, more precise synchronization of their collective dreaming. But it could be done. The Fayth were capable of dreaming entire architectural complexes into a persistent semi-reality that, to anyone within the dream, would be indistinguishable from physical existence. The final and most ambitious test came when Yu Yevon asked the Fayth to dream people, not vague humanoid shapes, but specific individuals, with faces and names and histories. He provided them with detailed descriptions of Zanarkand citizens who had been killed in the early stages of the war, asking the Fayth to recreate these people as completely as possible. The results were uncanny and deeply unsettling. The dream people moved and spoke, performed tasks and interacted with their environment, exhibited personality traits and preferences that matched what Yu Yevon remembered of the originals. They were not zombies or puppets, but seemingly autonomous individuals, and yet they were entirely dependent on the Fayth's constant dreaming. They were ghosts given form, memories made flesh, echoes of existence trapped in eternal recursion. Yu Yevon understood now what would be required to preserve Zanarkand. He would need thousands of Fayth, perhaps tens of thousands, all united in the single purpose of dreaming the city and its people into perpetual existence. These Fayth would need to be drawn from Zanarkand's population itself, from citizens who loved the city so completely that they would willingly surrender their individual existence, would choose to become part of an eternal dream, rather than face the certainty of Bevel's conquest. They would need to die, physically, permanently, but their deaths would not be endings so much as transformations. Their souls would be preserved in statues, in carefully prepared vessels that would protect and sustain them through centuries or millennia, and they would spend eternity dreaming Zanarkand, maintaining it in perfect stasis, preserving it exactly as it was in its final golden moment before Bevel's inevitable victory. This was the plan that Yu Yevon began to formulate in the last months before Zanarkand's fall, and it was simultaneously the most beautiful and most horrifying application of summoning ever conceived. It was beautiful because it would genuinely preserve Zanarkand, would ensure that the city's culture and philosophy and artistic achievements would survive long after the physical metropolis had crumbled to ruins. The dream Zanarkand would be perfect, unchanging, a crystallized moment of cultural triumph that could theoretically last forever, as long as the Fayth maintained their focus and their purpose. But it was also a form of damnation so profound that even Yu Yevon, in his more lucid moments, must have recognized the moral horror of what he was proposing. The Fayth who participated would be trapped in an eternal cycle of dreaming, unable to move forward into whatever afterlife or rebirth might exist, unable to change or grow or experience anything beyond their endless repetition of the same dream. The dream people of Zanarkand, the citizens who would live and move and speak in this phantom city, would not be truly alive. They would be echoes, copies, simulations running in an endless loop, experiencing the same joys and sorrows over and over, never truly progressing, never truly real. They would have the illusion of free will, the subjective experience of making choices, but ultimately they would be prisoners of a script written by the Fayth's collective memory of how Zanarkand had been. And perhaps most troubling of all, Yu Yevon's plan required a level of organization and coordination that seemed impossible under the circumstances. How could he convince thousands of Zanarkand's citizens to voluntarily become Fayth, to die so that they could dream forever? Even if they understood the necessity, even if they shared his desperate need to preserve something of Zanarkand's glory, how could they be certain that the plan would work, that their sacrifice would achieve anything more than their own eternal imprisonment? The answer came from Zanarkand's culture itself, from the deep reverence in which the city held its existing faith, from the belief that becoming Fayth was already understood as the highest form of service and spiritual achievement. Yu Yevon, leveraging his position as the city's greatest summoner and spiritual leader, began to speak of a new and ultimate form of faithhood, a mass transformation that would achieve something unprecedented in the history of summoning. He framed it not as a desperate last resort, but as Zanarkand's final and greatest artistic achievement, the summoning that would transcend all previous summonings, a work of spiritual art so profound that it would demonstrate once and for all the superiority of Zanarkand's philosophy over Bevel's crude materialism. The people of Zanarkand, facing the approach of Bevel's armies, understanding that their physical city was doomed, responded with a fervor that might seem insane to outside observers, but made perfect sense within Zanarkand's cultural framework. Thousands volunteered to become Fayth, to be part of this ultimate summoning. They saw it as martyrdom, yes, but martyrdom in service of something transcendent, a sacrifice that would echo through eternity. Entire families chose to become Fayth together, believing that in the dream, Zanarkand, they would be reunited, that their love for each other and for their city would be preserved in perfect amber, never to fade or be forgotten. Yu Yevon supervised the preparations with the meticulous care of someone who understood that he had only one opportunity to achieve this impossible goal. Great chambers were excavated beneath Zanarkand's central temple, vast halls where thousands of statues could be arranged in precise geometric patterns, each statue positioned to maximize the resonance between Fayth, to create a network of dreaming souls whose combined power could sustain an entire city. The volunteers were prepared through months of meditation and spiritual training, taught to synchronize their consciousness, to dream the same dream with perfect clarity, to surrender their individual wills while somehow retaining enough coherence to maintain the complexity of an entire civilization. As Bevel's forces drew closer, as the sounds of Machina war machines could be heard in the distance, as reconnaissance airships began to appear in the skies above Zanarkand, the transformation began. In ceremonies that lasted for days, the volunteers became Fayth, their souls extracted from their dying bodies and sealed within the statues that would be their eternal homes. It was a spectacle of both incredible beauty and unspeakable tragedy. Thousands of people dying willingly, their last thoughts focused not on their own extinction, but on the city they were giving everything to preserve, their consciousness merging into a collective dream that began to take form even as their bodies cooled. The Dream Zanarkand manifested somewhere beyond the physical world, in a pocket of reality accessible only through the focused dreaming of its Fayth, and it was perfect. Every tower stood exactly as it had stood in Zanarkand's final days. Every street and plaza and garden was preserved in flawless detail, and the people, the dream people who were copies of Zanarkand's citizens, woven from memory and longing, lived their lives in blissful ignorance of their own unreality, playing their blitzball games, attending their summoner academies, pursuing their art and culture in an eternal golden afternoon that would never progress into evening. But Yu Yevon understood that this was only half of the solution, and perhaps the easier half. The Dream Zanarkand would need protection, would need to be hidden from Bevel, and anyone else who might seek to destroy it or corrupt it. More than that, it would need power, an inexhaustible source of energy to sustain the faith through the centuries and millennia they would be dreaming, to ensure that their focus never wavered, that the dream never collapsed back into the nothingness from which it had been summoned. In those final days before Bevel's armies would breach Zanarkand's walls, as the dream city took form in its pocket of unreality and the Fayth settled into their eternal sleep, Yu Yevon confronted the ultimate problem that his vision had created, the question of power and protection across timescales that dwarfed human comprehension. The Dream Zanarkand would theoretically last as long as the Fayth could maintain their focus. But what happened when their will began to waver? When the sheer tedium of dreaming the same dream for centuries began to erode their concentration? What prevented Bevel, once it had conquered the physical Zanarkand, from hunting down the chamber where the Fayth slept and destroying them in their statues, ending the dream before it had barely begun? The solution that Yu Yevon devised in response to these questions would prove to be Spira's eternal curse, a cure so terrible that it became a disease worse than anything it was meant to prevent. He would create a guardian for the Dream Zanarkand, an aeon unlike any that had ever been summoned before, not a discrete entity called forth for specific purposes and then dismissed, but a permanent manifestation, a perpetual summoning sustained by armor forged from gravity itself, an aeon so powerful that it could defend the Fayth against any conceivable threat, and so monstrous that the entire world would fear it, would focus all their energy on avoiding its wrath, would never have the resources or the will to search for the hidden dream that it protected. This ultimate aeon would be called Sin, though whether Yu Yevon chose that name himself, or whether it was bestowed later by those who suffered its attacks, is lost to history. It would be massive beyond comprehension, a mountain given mobility, a floating fortress of organic armor and weapons that could destroy cities with the same casual ease that a human might crush an insect. It would be unkillable by any conventional means, its body protected not just by thick hide, but by a field of gravitic energy that could deflect projectiles and disintegrate matter, that made the very air around it shimmer and warp. And it would be self-sustaining, drawing power not from Yu Yevon's will alone, but from the Fayth themselves, from that vast network of dreaming souls whose combined spiritual energy could power both the Dream Zanarkand and its terrible guardian. But Sin would be more than just a weapon or a shield. Yu Yevon, in his increasingly desperate calculations, had come to understand that protecting the Fayth chamber and hiding the Dream Zanarkand would not be enough if Bevel was allowed to consolidate its victory, to spread its materialistic philosophy across all of Spira, to build a civilization so technologically advanced that eventually, inevitably, they would develop the means to pierce whatever defenses he could construct. The only way to truly ensure the dream's safety across deep time was to ensure that no such advanced civilization could ever arise again, that the very foundations of technological society would be shattered and could never be rebuilt, that Spira itself would be reduced to a state where Machina cities and airship fleets and all the tools that made Bevel's conquest possible would become impossible to create or sustain. Sin, therefore, would be designed not just as a guardian, but as an apocalypse, a recurring catastrophe that would periodically destroy any society that grew too large, too advanced, too reminiscent of the Machina civilization that had destroyed Zanarkand. It would attack cities seemingly at random, but with a terrible intelligence behind the randomness, targeting centers of population and technological development, ensuring that humanity on Spira would be forced to live in small, scattered settlements would be unable to build the kinds of institutions and infrastructure that might threaten the hidden dream. Every few years or decades, sin would rise from the ocean and lay waste to some thriving community, reminding survivors that safety was an illusion, that permanence was impossible, that the only constants in life were death and the terror that came from the deep. The moral dimensions of what Yu Yevon was planning, of what he must have understood he was planning, are staggering to contemplate. He was not merely willing to sacrifice his own humanity and the individual existence of thousands of volunteers. He was proposing to condemn all future generations of Spirans to lives of fear and loss, to ensure that no child born in the centuries to come would know the security of a stable civilization, that no community could ever grow without the shadow of sin's eventual return darkening their hopes. He was engineering perpetual trauma on a civilizational scale, weaponizing catastrophe, transforming his own grief and desperation into a curse that would outlast empires. Yet, from Yu Yevon's perspective, from the perspective of someone who had watched Bevel's Machina armies systematically destroy everything he loved, who had seen the culture he revered dismissed as primitive and inefficient, who understood that Zanarkand's physical destruction was not just inevitable but imminent. This was not cruelty but necessity. What did the suffering of future generations matter when weighed against the preservation of Zanarkand itself? What were scattered villages and fearful populations compared to the survival of beauty and art and spiritual refinement in their perfected, eternal form? The Dream Zanarkand would be Spira's gift to the future, proof that humanity could achieve grace and wisdom, and if the cost of that gift was that future Spirans would live in darkness, unable to appreciate what they were being given, unable even to know it existed, well, that was a price Yu Yevon was willing to pay, a sacrifice he would make on their behalf, whether they consented or not. The technical achievement required to create sin was unprecedented, pushing summoning far beyond anything that had been attempted even in Zanarkand's most ambitious experiments. Yu Yevon began with the fundamental template of an aeon, a manifestation of will and faith given temporary physical form through the focused dreaming of the Fayth, but then modified and expanded that template in ways that violated every conventional understanding of the art. Where normal aeons were ephemeral, existing only as long as the summoner maintained their concentration, sin would be permanent, sustained not by active focus, but by the passive emanations of thousands of Fayth, whose primary purpose was dreaming. Zanarkand, but whose excess spiritual energy could be channeled into maintaining their guardian. The armor of sin was perhaps the most ingenious and horrifying innovation. Yu Yevon understood that any physical form, no matter how powerful, could theoretically be destroyed given sufficient force, but gravity was different. Gravity was a fundamental property of reality itself, a force that could be manipulated but never truly negated. He designed sin's outer shell not as simple armor, but as a field of controlled gravitational distortion, areas where space itself was warped so severely that projectiles would be deflected, where energy weapons would be absorbed and redistributed, where even the most powerful Machina weapons would find their force scattered and rendered ineffective. Getting through sin's armor would require not just power, but the ability to unweave reality itself, to undo the gravitational manipulations that held it together, a task that would prove beyond the capability of any technology Bevel possessed. But the armor served another purpose beyond mere protection. It was a cage, a prison for Yu Yevon himself, because he understood that creating and maintaining sin would require something no summoner had ever attempted: perpetual communion with an aeon, a merging of consciousness so complete and so permanent that the boundary between summoner and summon would cease to exist. to become Sin's eternal pilot, to guide it across centuries and ensure it fulfilled its purpose of protecting the dream and preventing advanced civilization from rising. Yu Yevon would need to give up his individual existence even more completely than the Fayth had given up theirs. The Fayth, at least, retained some form of identity within their collective dream. They were diminished, merged into a group consciousness, but fragments of who they had been persisted in the patterns of the dream they wove. Yu Yevon would have no such preservation. To merge with Sin completely enough to control it, to become the animating intelligence behind its terrible purpose, he would need to reduce himself to pure function, to strip away memory and personality and everything that made him human, until only the essential drive remained: protect the dream, destroy Machina's civilization, ensure Zanarkand survives. He would become less than human, less than the Fayth, less even than the eons, which at least served their summoners with some form of awareness. He would become a ghost, haunting a living weapon, a fragment of will so focused on its single purpose that it could no longer remember why that purpose mattered or what it had sacrificed to achieve it. As Bevel's forces breached Zanarkand's outer walls, as the sounds of combat filled the city's streets, as the beautiful towers that had stood for centuries began to crumble under Machina bombardment, Yu Yevon performed the final summoning. In the deepest chamber where the Fayth slept their eternal sleep, surrounded by tens of thousands of souls all dreaming in perfect synchrony, he called upon their power to create the ultimate aeon, and the gravitic armor began to form around him, layer upon layer of reality warping force that would protect Sin and imprison its creator in equal measure. The transformation was agonizing, not physical pain, for Yu Yevon's body was quickly consumed and integrated into the mass of Sin's forming shell, but a spiritual agony as his consciousness was stretched and compressed, as memories were burned away to make room for the vast intelligence required to control such a being, as his identity was systematically dismantled and replaced with pure purpose. He had time for one last coherent thought, one final moment of clarity before the merger became complete and Yu Yevon as an individual ceased to exist. We cannot know what that thought was, whether it was triumph at having achieved the impossible, or horror at what he had become, or simple regret for the world he was about to condemn to centuries of suffering. Perhaps it was something simpler, more human, a memory of Zanarkand as it had been in better days, a final glimpse of beauty before beauty became irrelevant and only the mission remained. Sin emerged from the ruined temple at the moment of Zanarkand's final defeat, rising from the rubble like a mountain given motion, its massive form blotting out the sun, its gravity armor rippling with power that made the air itself scream. The Bevel forces that had been celebrating their victory froze in horror as this new and incomprehensible threat appeared before them, as Sin turned its attention toward their Machina legions and demonstrated that all their technological superiority meant nothing against a being that could ignore physics itself. The gravitic fields swept across the battlefield, crushing Machina weapons like toys, pulling airships from the sky, reducing Bevel's proud forces to scattered survivors fleeing in terror from something they could neither fight nor comprehend. But Sin did not pursue the fleeing Bevel troops, did not chase them back to their fortress city to complete Zanarkand's vengeance. That would have been human emotion, human rage, and whatever piloted Sin now was no longer human enough for such feelings. Instead, Sin turned its attention to Zanarkand itself, to the physical city that no longer served any purpose, that was now merely a liability, a collection of ruins that might give clues to Sin's origin or the location of the Fayth. with the same dispassionate efficiency that it had demonstrated against Bevel's forces. Sin began to destroy what remained of Zanarkand, reducing its towers to rubble, collapsing its streets, ensuring that nothing would remain to mark the spot where the greatest city in Spira had stood. The Fayth chamber, deep beneath the temple, survived this destruction. It had been built to endure, protected by layers of physical and spiritual shielding that even Sin's power could not easily breach. But the city above was scoured from existence, its location eventually buried beneath layers of ash and earth and time, its exact coordinates lost to history, known only to Sin itself, which would return periodically to patrol the area, ensuring that no excavation or exploration could ever uncover the sleeping Fayth and the dream they maintained. As Sin vanished into the ocean, beginning its eternal patrol of Spira's waters, the survivors of both Zanarkand and Bevel tried to make sense of what had happened. Bevel's forces had won the war in the conventional sense. Zanarkand was destroyed, its people dead or scattered, its culture apparently obliterated. But the victory was hollow, poisoned by the emergence of Sin, by the understanding that they had not defeated Zanarkand so much as transformed it into something far more dangerous. The Machina weapons that had seemed so powerful, that had promised Bevel dominance over all Spira, were worse than useless against Sin. They seemed to attract its attention, to draw its attacks. Cities that relied heavily on Machina technology found themselves targeted, destroyed with such completeness that within a generation, the very word Machina became synonymous with doom. Bevel itself suffered terribly in the years immediately following Sin's creation. The fortress city's technological infrastructure, so dependent on Machina, made it a target that Sin returned to again and again, each attack destroying more of the city's advanced systems, forcing its population to choose between their machines and their survival. Gradually, desperately, Bevel began to dismantle its own civilization, to tear down the Machina factories and research facilities, to suppress the knowledge that had made its dominance possible, all in a futile attempt to appease the monster that Zanarkand's final summoner had unleashed upon the world. And through it all, in a pocket of reality sustained by the dreams of 10,000 souls, Zanarkand lived on, perfect and unchanging, its citizens going about their lives in blissful ignorance of their own unreality, playing their eternal game of blitzball, attending their summoner academies, pursuing beauty and grace in a golden stasis that would last for 1,000 years and beyond. In the chaos that followed Sin's emergence, as Spira's great cities crumbled and its populations scattered into isolated settlements, the survivors struggled to make sense of a world that had fundamentally changed, that offered no safety and no promise that tomorrow would resemble today. The old certainties, that technological progress was inevitable, that human civilization would continue to advance, that power and knowledge could shield against any threat, had been obliterated along with Zanarkand's towers and Bevel's Machina factories. What remained was fear, pure and primal, the understanding that humanity on Spira now existed at the sufferance of an unkillable monster whose attacks seemed random but were terrifying in their comprehensiveness, destroying not just buildings and people, but hope itself, the very possibility of building something permanent. Into this void of meaning came the interpretations, the desperate human need to understand suffering by assigning it purpose, to transform random catastrophe into something that could be comprehended, controlled, or at least predicted through the application of rules and rituals. The survivors needed to believe that Sin's attacks were not arbitrary, that there was some pattern to the destruction, some behavior that might appease the monster or at least delay its wrath. And so the stories began, narratives that attempted to explain sin's existence and prescribe responses that might ensure survival, frameworks of meaning that would gradually crystallize into doctrine and eventually into the religious system that would dominate Spira for a millennium. The earliest interpretations varied wildly between communities. Some survivors believed sin was a natural disaster, akin to earthquakes or typhoons, but vastly more destructive, a force of nature that could be predicted through observation and avoided through careful settlement placement. Others saw it as divine punishment, though punishment for what crime remained unclear. Was it the war between Zanarkand and Bevel, the development of Machina technology itself, or some more fundamental human failing that had angered the gods? Still others, particularly among the scattered remnants of Zanarkand's population, whispered darker truths, that sin was not punishment but protection, that it had been created deliberately by Yu Yevon, though the purpose of such creation remained mysterious to those who had not been privy to the summoner's final plans. It was Bevel, despite having suffered so catastrophically in the war and its aftermath, that ultimately shaped the dominant narrative that would become Yevon's teachings. The fortress city's priests and scholars, faced with the collapse of everything their society had valued, engaged in a remarkable act of theological and political reconstruction, transforming their city's defeat into a form of spiritual victory by claiming that they had been right all along, that they had seen the truth even as they pursued the wrong methods of responding to it. The Bevel interpretation, which would become orthodoxy within 2 generations, held that sin was indeed punishment. Punishment for humanity's pride, for the belief that mortals could achieve godhood through technology and knowledge, for the construction of Machina cities that challenged the natural order and attempted to place human will above divine law. Zanarkand and Bevel, the priest declared, had both been guilty of this fundamental sin of hubris. Zanarkand through its excessive pride in artistic and spiritual achievement, Bevel through its reliance on Machina and military might. The war between them had merely been the outward expression of humanity's internal corruption, and sin was the god's response, a purifying force that would continue to scour Spira until humanity learned humility, accepted its proper place in the cosmic order, and renounced the technologies and philosophies that had led to such catastrophe. This interpretation was both self-serving and strategically brilliant. It allowed Bevel's ruling class to maintain their authority even as they dismantled their city's technological base, transforming from military leaders into spiritual guides who claimed special knowledge of how to appease sin and live righteously in the new order it had imposed. The priests, who had once blessed Machina weapons, now preached against them, declaring that the use of Machina was the very sin that perpetuated sin's existence, that each machine built brought the monster closer, that the only path to eventual peace was complete renunciation of the technological achievements that had defined the previous age. Central to this emerging theology was the concept of atonement, the belief that Spira's people bore collective guilt for the sins of their ancestors, that they must engage in perpetual penance to slowly reduce this burden, and that only through generations or perhaps centuries of righteous living might humanity eventually earn sin's departure. This doctrine served multiple purposes for Bevel's transformed priesthood. It explained why sin persisted despite the abandonment of Machina technology. The debt was too great to be paid quickly. It justified the priesthood's authority. Someone needed to determine what constituted righteous living and proper atonement. And it created a framework of meaning that gave suffering purpose, transforming random victimhood into spiritual trial, making the unbearable slightly more bearable by suggesting that pain served some higher function in humanity's eventual redemption. The irony, of course, was that this interpretation was almost entirely wrong. Sin was not divine punishment, but a weapon. Not the god's will, but one man's desperate innovation. Not purification, but protection, for a dream that the vast majority of Spirans did not even know existed. But truth mattered less than utility in those early, chaotic years, and Bevel's narrative provided what survivors needed most: structure, hope, and the illusion of control through proper behavior and belief. As the decades passed and Bevel's interpretation spread across Spira's scattered settlements, it evolved and elaborated, incorporating elements from other traditions, adapting to local needs, gradually becoming more sophisticated and comprehensive. The priesthood that had begun as Bevel's religious authority transformed into something larger and more organized, establishing temples in every major settlement, training new generations of priests and meisters who would spread the teachings and maintain orthodoxy. And at some point in this process, the exact moment is lost to history. The religion ceased to be merely Bevel's state cult and became Yevon's church, named for the summoner whose final act had created sin, though the church's teachings bore little resemblance to anything Yu Yevon himself would have recognized or endorsed. The decision to name the church after Yu Yevon was itself remarkable, a testament to how thoroughly Bevel's priesthood had appropriated and transformed Zanarkand's legacy. In the original conflict, Yu Yevon had been Bevel's enemy, the greatest of Zanarkand's summoners, the architect of their defeat. But in the new theology, he became something different, a martyr, perhaps, or a prophet who had understood truths that others missed, whose creation of sin was reinterpreted as an act of divine will, working through human agency, whose name could be invoked as the founder of the new order precisely because he was safely dead and could not contradict the doctrines promulgated in his name. The church taught that Yu Yevon had been the first to truly understand humanity's sin, that his creation of the monster was an act of sacrifice, transforming himself into an eternal reminder of the price of pride. Some versions of the doctrine even suggested that Yu Yevon still existed within sin in some form, a consciousness trapped in eternal torment as penance for his own role in the Machina age's excesses, suffering on behalf of all humanity. These teachings were closer to the truth than their promulgators knew, though they misunderstood the nature of Yu Yevon's transformation and the purpose behind it. Yu Yevon did indeed exist within sin, but not as a penitent soul, rather as the bare minimum of consciousness required to pilot the weapon, a ghost of purpose haunting armor of gravity, so diminished and focused that it could no longer be meaningfully called human. As Yevon's church grew in power and influence, it developed an increasingly elaborate theology that attempted to explain every aspect of Spira's new reality. The spiral became the religion's central symbol, representing the cycle of death and rebirth, the wheel of suffering that humanity must traverse on its path to eventual redemption. Life on Spira was understood as fundamentally cyclical. Souls were born, lived, died, and were reborn in an endless pattern that mirrored sin's own cyclical appearances and disappearances. The fireflies that appeared when people died, those luminescent manifestations of departing souls, were interpreted as visual proof of this cycle, evidence that death was not an ending but a transition, that the departed would be reborn and have another chance to live righteously and contribute to Spira's collective atonement. The sending, one of Yevon's most important rites, emerged from this understanding of death and the soul's journey. The church taught that souls needed to be guided to the far plane, the realm where the dead gathered before rebirth, and that without proper sending, souls might linger in the physical world, becoming fiends, twisted, dangerous creatures that threatened the living. Summoners, in the new order, became primarily psychopomps, guides for the dead. Their role transformed from Zanarkand's vision of summoners as artists and scholars into something more focused and more grim. A summoner's primary duty was to travel Spira performing sendings, ensuring that the dead moved on properly, that the cycle remained unbroken, that fiends did not proliferate and add to the world's already overwhelming burden of suffering. But the Church also taught that there was another way summoners could serve, a higher calling that offered the possibility of breaking the cycle itself, or at least temporarily interrupting it, the pilgrimage to defeat sin. This teaching emerged gradually, crystallizing around the figure of the first summoner who managed to destroy sin's physical form, and discovered that doing so brought what came to be called the calm, a period of peace lasting years or sometimes even a decade, during which sin did not manifest and attack, during which Spira's people could rebuild, could know something approaching safety, could dare to hope that perhaps this time the monster would not return. The exact identity of this first successful summoner is disputed. Different temples and different regions of Spira claim the honor for their own historical figures, and likely multiple summoners in different locations discovered the technique independently. What mattered was not who did it first, but that it could be done at all, that sin was not entirely unkillable, but could be temporarily defeated, dispersed back into pyroflies only to reform later, the cycle beginning anew. This discovery transformed the nature of summoning on Spira, gave it purpose beyond merely guiding the dead, created the tradition of the pilgrimage that would define the religion for centuries to come. The pilgrimage, as codified by Yevon's church, was an ordeal of faith and endurance that tested summoners to their absolute limits. A summoner would begin their journey at their home temple, receiving the blessing of the local clergy, then travel to each of Spira's major temples in sequence: Besed, Kilika, Jose, Makalania, Bevel itself, and finally the Calm Lands and Zanarkand's ruins, praying at each temple to receive the blessing of that temple's faith. These faith, souls who had volunteered to be sealed in statues, would grant the summoner the ability to call forth specific eons, spiritual beings of immense power that could fight on the summoner's behalf. With each temple visited, each aeon acquired, the summoner grew stronger, more capable, moving closer to the power required to challenge sin itself. But the pilgrimage was designed to be grueling, even deadly. The temples were deliberately positioned to require crossing Spira's most dangerous territories: the Thunder Plains, where lightning struck continuously, the frozen expanse of the Macalania Woods, the monster-infested paths between settlements. Summoners traveled with guardians, warriors who protected them from fiends and other threats. But even with protection, many summoners died before reaching Zanarkand's ruins, the pilgrimage's final destination, and the place where the ultimate test awaited. Those who survived the journey, who successfully prayed at all the temples and obtained all the necessary eons, would then face the Calm Lands and beyond, territories so dangerous that only the most powerful and determined could traverse them. The Church taught that reaching Zanarkand's ruins was necessary because that was where summoners would receive the final summoning, a technique of such power that it could destroy sin where ordinary aeons could not. The exact nature of the final summoning was kept secret, known only to the highest meisters of Yevon, and revealed only to summoners who successfully completed the pilgrimage. But it was understood to be the culmination of the summoner's art, the ultimate expression of their faith, and their willingness to sacrifice for Spira's sake. What the Church did not teach, what was hidden even from most of its own priests, was the terrible truth about the final summoning, that it required the summoner's death, that the technique involved transforming one of the summoner's guardians into the final aeon through through a process that bound them to the summoner's will, and that this final aeon would indeed be powerful enough to destroy sin, but at the cost of the summoner's life and the guardian's transformation into something no longer entirely human. And more horrifying still, the Church did not reveal that destroying sin with the final summoning was not a true victory but merely reset the cycle, because sin would reform around the final aeon itself, around the guardian who had been transformed, creating a new sin from the ashes of the old, ensuring that the pattern would continue, that hope would always be temporary, that the calm would always end and suffering would return. This cycle of false hope, pilgrimage, temporary victory, inevitable return, served multiple purposes for Yevon's church. It demonstrated the religion's value by providing real respite from sin's attacks, giving people reason to maintain their faith and support the church's authority. It channeled the population's desire for resistance into a controlled form that ultimately changed nothing, preventing more radical or effective approaches to the sin problem from developing. And it ensured that the church's power would never be permanently challenged, because even the most successful summoner, the one who reached Zanarkand and performed the final summoning, would die, leaving the church as the only permanent institution, the only source of continuity and authority that persisted through the cycles of calm and return. The Meisters who governed the church, particularly those at the highest levels, particularly Grand Meister Mika, who would eventually reveal his own unsent nature, understood this cycle's perpetuity with a cynicism that bordered on nihilism. They knew that sin could not be truly defeated by the final summoning, knew that they were sending summoners to their deaths not to save Spira, but to maintain the illusion of hope, to buy time, to preserve the social order that gave the church its power. Some Meisters justified this deception as necessary. Without the hope provided by the calms, Spira's populations might despair completely, might turn to forbidden Machina or other dangerous innovations in desperate attempts to defeat sin. Better to maintain the cycle, to preserve stability through controlled suffering, than to risk the chaos that might result from acknowledging the truth. But there were elements within the church, particularly among the warrior monks and some of the lower-ranking priests, who began to question this arrangement, who wondered whether there might be other ways to combat sin, whether the prohibition on Machina was truly necessary or merely convenient for maintaining the church's authority. These doubts were suppressed harshly when they surfaced, branded as heresy, their proponents excommunicated or worse. The Al-Behed, a cultural group that maintained Machina traditions, despite Yevon's prohibitions, faced persecution and marginalization, their settlements attacked, their language and customs suppressed, their very existence treated as evidence of the sinful pride that had created sin in the first place. The irony that sin itself was created through summoning, the very art that Yevon's church celebrated and depended upon, was lost on most believers. The church taught that Yu Yevon's use of summoning had been different, had been corrupted by pride and improper purpose, that modern summoning, as practiced by the church, was purified, properly humble, serving redemption rather than revenge. But this distinction was theological sleight of hand, an attempt to claim the power of summoning while disavowing responsibility for its ultimate expression, to worship Yu Yevon's name while condemning what he actually did. As the centuries accumulated, and Yevon's church became the dominant force in Spiran life, as temples spread across every island and settlement, as the teachings became so ubiquitous that questioning them became almost unthinkable, the original purposes behind sin's creation faded into myth and then into obscurity. The Dream Zanarkand continued to exist in its pocket of unreality, still protected by sin's eternal patrol, still sustained by the Fayth's perpetual dreaming, but knowledge of the dream's existence vanished from common awareness. The scattered survivors who had known the truth died. Their children knew only fragments. Their grandchildren knew nothing at all. Within 3 generations, the Dream Zanarkand was forgotten, and sin was understood purely through Yevon's theological framework: punishment, test, reminder of humanity's failings. Yu Yevon himself, the consciousness that had once been a man and a summoner, persisted within sin as something that could no longer be called either, a fragment of purpose so refined and focused that it had transcended personality, memory, individual existence. It maintained sin's armor, guided the weapon on its endless patrol, ensured that it destroyed any concentration of advanced technology or large population centers, protected the Fayth chamber buried beneath Zanarkand's ruins. But it did these things without understanding why anymore, without remembering Zanarkand's beauty or the love that had motivated its terrible final act. Yu Yevon had become pure function, an algorithm of protection running on spiritual hardware, a ghost that haunted a weapon without even the self-awareness to know that it was haunted. And so the spiral turned, century after century, each calm ending in sin's return, each generation of summoners walking the pilgrimage path to their deaths, each population rebuilding in the aftermath of attacks only to be destroyed again when they grew too large or too advanced. Spira had become a world locked in perpetual recursion, unable to progress, unable to escape, trapped in a cycle created by one man's desperate love for a city that no longer existed anywhere except in dreams. While Spira endured its cycles of destruction and false hope, while generations were born and died, knowing only the fear of sin and the hollow promise of temporary calms, the Fayth who dreamed Zanarkand into perpetual existence experienced time in a way that defied mortal comprehension. Their consciousness stretched across centuries like a single, endless moment. Their individual identities dissolved into a collective vision that never wavered and never truly changed. To be Fayth was to exist in a state between existence and non-existence, between sleep and waking, between the living world and whatever lay beyond death, trapped in an eternal act of creation that required every fragment of their spiritual energy to maintain. The Fayth's experience was fundamentally different from normal human consciousness, operating on principles that most Spirans, even most summoners, could not fully grasp. When a person became Fayth, when their soul was extracted from their dying body and sealed within a statue, through the ancient rites that Zanarkand's priests had perfected, their sense of linear time dissolved. Past, present, and future collapsed into a single eternal now, a perpetual moment of focused dreaming that stretched backward and forward without clear beginning or end. The Fayth did not remember the passage of time so much as exist within it all at once, aware of centuries as a continuous present, experiencing every moment of their dreaming simultaneously rather than sequentially. This temporal dissolution was both the source of their power and the nature of their imprisonment. Because the Fayth existed outside normal time, they could maintain their dream with perfect consistency across centuries. The Dream Zanarkand did not age or decay, did not accumulate the small variations and degradations that would naturally occur if the dream was being actively constructed moment by moment. Instead, it simply was, held in perfect stasis by dreamers who experienced no passage of time to mark change or decay. The city's towers stood eternally as they had stood on the day the Fayth began their dreaming. The citizens went about their lives in patterns that repeated with flawless precision. The Blitzball games played out according to scripts written by collective memory and never diverged from those scripts because the dreamers knew no other way the games could unfold. But this same temporal dissolution meant that the Fayth were utterly trapped, unable to escape their role, unable to simply stop dreaming and allow themselves to move on to whatever afterlife or rebirth awaited beyond the far plane. They had surrendered too much of their individual will, merged too completely with the collective consciousness, lost too much of what made them discrete entities capable of choice. The Fayth were not slaves in the conventional sense. No external force compelled them to continue dreaming, but they were prisoners of their own transformation, locked into a pattern they had chosen, but could no longer unchoose, bound by commitments made when they were still human to a purpose they could no longer fully remember or understand. Some fragment of awareness persisted within the collective, some residual echo of what it meant to be individual, to have desires and fears distinct from the group. This fragment was what allowed certain Fayth, under extraordinary circumstances, to communicate with living summoners, to speak in dreams or visions, to offer cryptic warnings or fragmentary revelations. But these communications were difficult, painful, requiring immense effort to separate enough from the collective to form coherent thoughts, to remember language and the concerns of the living, to bridge the gap between the eternal now of Fayth consciousness and the linear time that mortals inhabited. The Fayth's burden was not merely the effort of maintaining the Dream Zanarkand, though that alone would have been considerable. 10,000 souls holding a perfect vision of an entire city, complete with weather patterns and architectural details, and hundreds of thousands of dream citizens, each citizen with their own simulated personality and daily routine. This was a feat of collective consciousness that dwarfed any normal summoning, that required spiritual energy on a scale that single summoners could never hope to generate. But beyond maintaining the dream, the Fayth also provided the power for sin itself, their excess spiritual energy channeled into sustaining the armor that protected both them and the dream, into fueling the weapon's movements and attacks, into ensuring that Yu Yevon's consciousness within sin had the resources it needed to fulfill its eternal mission of protection and destruction. This dual purpose, dreaming Zanarkand and powering sin, created a terrible irony that the Fayth were aware of in whatever limited way their diminished consciousness could comprehend irony. They had volunteered to preserve Zanarkand, to save something beautiful from obliteration, to ensure that their city's culture and achievements would survive even if its physical form was destroyed, and they had succeeded in that goal. The Dream Zanarkand was perfect, unchanged, eternal. But the cost of that preservation was that they also sustained sin, the weapon that ensured the rest of Spira could never achieve anything resembling the beauty and advancement that Zanarkand had represented. They were simultaneously preserving civilization and preventing it, saving art while ensuring that art could never again flourish anywhere except in their isolated dream. Some Fayth, in their brief moments of individual awareness, experienced this as anguish, as a realization that they had been tricked or had tricked themselves, that the price of Zanarkand's survival was Spira's perpetual suffering. Others rationalized it as necessary, as the only possible response to Bevel's aggression, as a sacrifice that future generations would someday understand and appreciate, even if they could not know of it now. But most of the time, the Fayth existed beyond such concerns, their consciousness so merged with the collective that individual guilt or regret or hope became meaningless categories, subsumed into the single, overriding purpose. Dream the dream, maintain the vision, keep Zanarkand alive. The dream citizens of Zanarkand, the simulated people who lived and moved within the Fayth's collective vision, were perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this entire arrangement. They appeared to be fully conscious, to have thoughts and feelings and desires, to make choices and form relationships and experience joy and sorrow. They had distinct personalities. Some were outgoing, others reserved. Some were ambitious, others content with simple pleasures. They remembered their pasts, made plans for their futures, worried about their children, and celebrated their achievements. By every external measure, by every test that one might apply to determine consciousness, they appeared to be real people living real lives. But they were not real in any conventional sense. They were constructs, patterns, woven from the Fayth's collective memory of what Zanarkand's citizens had been like. Scripts running in a simulation, sustained by spiritual energy rather than physical matter. They had no souls of their own, no existence independent of the Fayth's constant dreaming. If the Fayth stopped dreaming for even a moment, the dream citizens would simply cease to exist, would not die in any meaningful sense, but would simply unbe, returning to the nothingness from which they had been summoned. The philosophical questions raised by the dream citizens' existence were profound and troubling. Were they conscious or merely simulating consciousness so perfectly that the difference became meaningless? Did they suffer? And if so, did their suffering matter when it was the suffering of beings who were not, in any fundamental sense, real? Was it ethical to create such beings, to give them the illusion of life and choice while denying them actual existence or the possibility of growth and change? The Fayth, in their diminished state, could not fully grapple with these questions, but some fragment of awareness must have wrestled with the guilt of having created a city full of ghosts, of having populated their perfect dream with people who could never be more than echoes, than memories given temporary form. Titus himself, when he eventually learned the truth of his own nature, would face these questions in the most personal way possible. He was one of the dream citizens, created by the Fayth's collective vision, given personality and memory and the subjective experience of being alive, but ultimately dependent on the Fayth's constant dreaming for his very existence. His relationships were real to him, his complicated feelings about his father, Yecht, his growing love for Yuna, his friendships with his companions, but they were the relationships of a being who existed only in the margins between dreams and reality, who would cease to be the moment the Fayth stopped dreaming, or the moment he ventured too far from the dream's boundaries. The dream, Zanarkand itself, was a pocket dimension, existing in a space that was neither fully part of Spira's physical reality, nor entirely separate from it. It could be accessed, though the method of access was not widely known. Certain locations, certain spiritual conditions, certain alignments of faith and will could create temporary doorways between the dream and the waking world. This is how Yecht had originally entered Spira proper, how Titus would eventually follow, transported from the dream by sin itself, in a moment of recognition or coincidence or fate, carried from the false Zanarkand into the real world where his unreality would become first a source of confusion and then a terrible revelation. The Fayth's relationship with living summoners who came to the temple seeking eons was complex and multi-layered. When a summoner prayed at a temple and received an aeon, they were not being granted a gift by some distant deity, but entering into a covenant with the Fayth within that temple's statue, borrowing power from these eternal dreamers who could spare a fraction of their consciousness to manifest as an eon while still maintaining their primary task of dreaming Zanarkand. The aeons that summoners called forth were fragments of the Fayth's collective power, subsets of their consciousness given temporary form to fight alongside the summoner, bound to the summoner's will through the covenant established during prayer. This relationship meant that summoners were, in a sense, participating in the same system that sustained sin, drawing power from the same spiritual engine that made the weapon possible. Though few summoners understood this connection, the church taught that aeons were blessings, gifts from Yu Yevon or from some higher divine source, rewards for faith and purity. They did not teach that eons were fragments of consciousness, torn from souls who had been dreaming for 1,000 years, that each summoning added to the burden those souls carried, that the entire system of pilgrimage and eon summoning was built on the exploitation of beings who could no longer refuse consent because they had surrendered their individual will so completely that refusal was no longer a concept they could grasp. Over the centuries, as summoner after summoner completed the pilgrimage and performed the final summoning, as each generation hoped that this time this summoner would truly defeat sin rather than merely delay it, the Fayth's exhaustion grew. It was not physical exhaustion. They had no bodies to tire, but a deeper spiritual weariness, a degradation of the will and focus required to maintain their eternal task. The Dream Zanarkand remained perfect, but the effort required to keep it perfect increased incrementally with each passing decade, like a muscle forced to hold the same position for so long that even maintaining stillness becomes agony. Some Fayth began to hope for release, to wish that a summoner would come who could truly end the cycle, who could defeat sin permanently rather than just resetting it, who could free them from their eternal dreaming and allow them to finally move on to whatever lay beyond. But they did not know how such a thing could be accomplished, could not explain what would be required, could only offer cryptic hints and fragmentary visions to summoners who prayed at their temples, hoping that somehow one of these summoners would understand what they could not clearly articulate, that the cycle could only be broken if someone found a way to defeat sin without using the final summoning, without perpetuating the pattern that ensured sin's return. This growing desire for release among the Fayth created tensions within their collective consciousness, conflicts between those fragments that still believed in the original purpose, preserve Zanarkand at any cost, and those that had come to see the cost as unbearable, that wanted rest more than they wanted to continue their eternal vigil. These tensions sometimes manifested as inconsistencies in the dream, small glitches or variations that would quickly be corrected as the collective reasserted its unity, but they were signs of fractures in a system that had never been meant to last 1,000 years, that was showing strain under the weight of centuries it had never been designed to bear. As the centuries ground on and Yevon's church solidified its hold over Spiran society, the institution that claimed to preserve Yu Yevon's legacy became increasingly corrupt, increasingly distant from any recognizable form of the spiritual principles it ostensibly upheld. The Meisters who governed the church, particularly those at the highest levels who knew the terrible truths about sin and the final summoning, transformed from spiritual leaders into political manipulators, from guides seeking to ease suffering into power brokers seeking to maintain their authority regardless of the cost in lives and integrity. The corruption began subtly, as corruption often does, with small compromises that seemed reasonable at the time. The church needed resources to maintain the temples, to support the summoners, to send monks to protect settlements from fiends. Taxation was necessary, and who better to collect and distribute these resources than the church itself? The Meisters needed authority to enforce the teachings, to prevent dangerous heresies from spreading, to ensure that people avoided the Machina that might attract sin. Political power was necessary, and who better to wield it than those who understood Spira's spiritual needs? But power, once claimed, creates its own justifications for expansion. The church that began as a spiritual guide became a temporal government, controlling not just religious practice, but trade routes, settlement locations, marriage laws, and the training of the next generation. Maesters who began their service as idealists found themselves making compromises, permitting one forbidden practice to secure support in another area, overlooking corruption in a temple to maintain political alliances, suppressing information that might undermine faith even when that information was true. The ultimate corruption, the one that revealed how thoroughly the Church had abandoned its stated principles, was the state of the Meisters themselves. Grand Meister Mika, the leader of Yevon's church and ostensibly its holiest figure, was unsent, a dead person whose spirit had refused to depart to the far plane, clinging instead to earthly existence through sheer force of will. He was, by the Church's own teachings, an abomination, the very thing that sending was meant to prevent. The Church taught that lingering in the world after death was a form of corruption, that unsent souls became fiends, or at best, pitiful creatures unable to move forward, that one of the summoner's primary duties was to guide such souls to their proper rest. Yet Mika and other unsent Meisters maintained their positions, not despite this contradiction, but because of it. They had achieved a form of immortality that allowed them to maintain power across generations, to outlive any critics or reformers, to ensure that the Church's policies remained consistent, even as the mortal leadership below them changed. They justified this hypocrisy through theological gymnastics, claiming that their unsent state was different because they remained to serve Yevon, because their purpose was pure, because the rules that applied to common people did not apply to those who had transcended ordinary existence through spiritual achievement. The truth, which even Mika might have struggled to fully acknowledge to himself, was that they clung to existence because they feared death, because power had become so intoxicating that surrendering it seemed unbearable, because they had told themselves the lie that they were indispensable so many times that they had come to believe it. They had become the very thing they condemned in others, souls that refused to move on, that warped the natural cycle through their refusal to accept their place in it, that perpetuated themselves at the expense of those they claimed to serve. This hypocrisy extended throughout the Church's teachings and practices. The Church preached humility while maintaining temples of extraordinary opulence, structures whose construction required resources that could have fed thousands. It preached sacrifice while ensuring that Meisters lived in comfort, that the highest ranks of the priesthood enjoyed luxuries unavailable to common believers. It preached against Machina while secretly utilizing Machina technology in Bevel itself, in the depths where common people could not see, in the maintenance of facilities that the Church claimed were powered by spiritual energy alone. The warrior monks, the Church's military arm, embodied these contradictions perhaps more than any other group. They were taught the teachings of Yevon, required to memorize scriptures and demonstrate faith. Yet their primary function was violence, the protection of Church interests through force. They were told that their service was holy, that their swords struck down fiends and heretics in Yevon's name, but many of them were perceptive enough to notice the gap between doctrine and practice, to see that they were being used to maintain political control as much as to provide spiritual protection. Machina used within the Church, particularly in Bevel, represented the most flagrant and dangerous hypocrisy. The Church's central teaching, the fundamental prohibition that supposedly prevented sin's attacks, was the ban on Machina, the technology that had defined the civilization whose pride had supposedly created sin in the first place. Common Spirans were taught that even possessing Machina was sinful, that using it invited disaster, that any community that tolerated Machina technology was courting sin's inevitable retaliation. The Albhed, who maintained Machina traditions, faced persecution as heretics, their settlements attacked by Yevon's faithful, their children taken and re-educated in the proper teachings. Yet, within Bavel's innermost sanctums, Machina hummed and functioned, performing tasks that the church claimed were impossible without such forbidden technology. Elevators operated on Machina mechanisms. Security systems utilized Machina sensors and automated defenses. Even the chamber where Via Infinito descended into the earth was maintained by Machina systems that controlled temperature and prevented collapse. The Meisters justified this as necessary exception, as technology preserved from the old world for essential purposes, as different from new Machina construction. But these were transparencies of rationalization, obvious to anyone who looked closely enough to see. The truth was that the ban on Machina had never been about preventing Sin's attacks. Sin did not actually care about Machina use, would attack villages that possessed no technology as readily as cities that employed it. The ban served political purposes, ensured that no power base could arise to challenge the church's authority, prevented populations from achieving the technological sophistication that might allow them to defend themselves without requiring the church's mediation. An armed, technologically advanced population was a population that might ask uncomfortable questions, might demand accountability, might notice that the church's teachings did not align with observed reality. This pattern of control through prohibition extended beyond Machina to other areas of Spiran life. The church discouraged literacy beyond basic levels, limiting access to historical texts, ensuring that most people knew only what the church taught in its temples and ceremonies. It discouraged travel beyond necessary pilgrimage routes, maintaining that such wandering was spiritually dangerous, that people should remain in their communities under the guidance of local priests. It discouraged questioning and critical thinking, framing doubt as weakness of faith, ensuring that those who perceived contradictions learned to suppress their perceptions rather than voice them. The final summoning itself, the supposed culmination of the pilgrimage and the means by which sin could be defeated, was perhaps the greatest of Yevon's lies, not because it did not work, but because the church knew it did not truly work, knew that defeating sin through the final summoning only created a new sin, knew that they were sending summoners to their deaths, not to save Spira, but to buy temporary respite and maintain the illusion that Yevon's teachings offered real solutions rather than empty gestures. The Meisters who knew this truth, and at the highest levels, they all knew it, had made a collective decision that the lie was necessary, that Spira's populations needed hope even if that hope was false, that the alternative to the controlled cycle of pilgrimage and calm was social collapse and despair. They told themselves that they were serving the greater good, that their deception was a burden they bore on behalf of those too weak or simple to understand the truth. They had become convinced that they alone had the wisdom to govern, that their power was justified by their willingness to carry knowledge too terrible for common people to comprehend. But this paternalistic justification masked a deeper, uglier truth, that the Meisters benefited enormously from the cycle they maintained, that each calm renewed faith in the church, that each summoner's death demonstrated the necessity of Yevon's teachings, that the perpetuation of the crisis ensured the perpetuation of the authority claimed to address it. The church had become a parasitic institution, feeding on the very suffering it claimed to alleviate, requiring the continuation of sin's existence to justify its own. Seymour Guado, in his twisted way, understood this more clearly than perhaps any other Meister, and his response was to embrace the nihilism that lurked beneath the church's hypocrisy. If the cycle could not be broken, if suffering was eternal and hope was false, then why not end the suffering by ending existence itself? His plan to become sin, to use the weapon's power to kill everyone on Spira, was logical extension of the Church's own premises. If life on Spira was nothing but cycles of death and false hope, then the merciful act was to end life entirely, to grant final rest to a world that could find no other path to peace. The other Meisters recoiled from Seymour's conclusion even as they could not fully articulate why it was wrong, why continuing the cycle was preferable to ending it. They condemned him as mad, as corrupted, as having misunderstood Yevon's teachings. But the truth was that Seymour had understood those teachings too well, had followed their logic to its inevitable conclusion, and found nothing there but despair, wearing the mask of faith, control wearing the mask of salvation, perpetual death wearing the mask of eternal hope. The Al-Behed, persecuted and marginalized, had developed their own response to Yevon's hypocrisy. They rejected the teachings entirely, maintained Machina traditions, not from ignorance, but from defiant conviction that the Church's prohibitions were political rather than spiritual, that sin's attacks had no relationship to technological development, that Spira's people deserved the truth rather than comfortable lies. Their leader Seed's plan to kidnap summoners before they could complete their pilgrimage to prevent the perpetuation of the cycle by preventing the final summoning was crude but based on accurate understanding, that the pilgrimage served the Church more than it served Spira, that saving individual summoners was worth the cost of shorter calms. Yet even the Al-Bed could not break the cycle, could only resist it around the margins, because they lacked the crucial knowledge that the Church hoarded, the nature of sin itself, the relationship between sin and Yu Yevon, the role of the Fayth in sustaining both the weapon and the dream it protected. Without this knowledge, resistance could only be partial, incomplete, ultimately ineffective against a system designed to perpetuate itself across centuries, to absorb dissent and crisis and emerge unchanged. The warriors of the Crusaders, ordinary Spirans who had organized themselves to fight sin directly, rather than wait for a summoner to complete the pilgrimage, represented another form of resistance to Yevon's authority. Operation Mi'ihen, their attempt to draw sin into an ambush and destroy it through coordinated assault, violated Church teaching by relying on forbidden weapons and unauthorized action. The Church opposed the operation, not because it might fail, but because it might succeed, because a victory achieved outside the pilgrimage system would demonstrate that Yevon's authority was not necessary, that ordinary people could defend themselves without priestly mediation. The operation's catastrophic failure, sin destroying the Crusaders and their weapons with contemptuous ease, was cited by the Church as proof that Yevon's teachings were correct, that humanity's proper role was humility and obedience rather than pride and self-determination. But the failure proved only that sin was powerful, not that the Church's methods were the only path to victory. It did not prove that Machina was inherently sinful, only that the Crusaders had underestimated their enemy. It did not validate Yevon's theology, only demonstrated the practical difficulty of the problem that theology claimed to address. Through all these layers of hypocrisy and control, the Church maintained its authority through a combination of genuine belief among lower ranks, political calculation among higher ones, and the simple fact that it offered something, however inadequate, however corrupted, where the alternative seemed to be nothing. Spira's people needed structure, needed hope, needed to believe that their suffering had meaning, and that following certain practices might reduce that suffering or at least ensure that their sacrifices served some greater purpose. Yevon's Church provided these things, and the cost, submission to authority, acceptance of contradictions, surrender of autonomy and critical thinking, seemed bearable compared to facing the void of meaninglessness that might lie beneath the comfortable lies. But systems built on lies, no matter how long they persist, carry within them the seeds of their own destruction, and the longer they endure, the more catastrophic their eventual collapse becomes. Yevon's church, after 1,000 years of accumulated contradictions and compounded hypocrisies, had become a structure so riddled with internal tensions that it required only the right catalyst, the right moment of revelation, to bring the entire edifice crashing down. That catalyst would come in the form of a summoner who asked questions that were not supposed to be asked, who pursued truths that were meant to remain hidden, who refused to accept that suffering must be eternal simply because it had always been so. Yuna's pilgrimage began in the traditional way, following the path that countless summoners before her had walked, adhering to the rituals and protocols that Yevon's church had codified over centuries of practice. She was the daughter of High Summoner Braska, who had defeated sin 10 years prior and brought the most recent calm, a legacy that weighed upon her with expectations both heavy and precious. Her guardians gathered around her with the same motivations that had driven guardians for generations: duty, love, faith, the desperate hope that this summoner might be different, might achieve something more permanent than the temporary victories that had defined all previous pilgrimages. But from the beginning, Yuna's pilgrimage carried seeds of difference, elements that would distinguish it from the endless repetitions that had come before. Titus, pulled from the Dream Zanarkand into Spira's reality by sin itself, brought with him an outsider's perspective, an inability to accept the supposedly self-evident truths that Spirans had internalized through lifetimes of Yevon's teachings. Where others saw the pilgrimage as necessary and noble, Titus saw only that it required Yuna's death, and asked the simple, devastating question that no one was supposed to ask: why must the summoner die? Where others accepted sin's existence as punishment for humanity's sins, Titus, coming from a world where sin did not exist, saw it as a problem to be solved rather than penance to be endured. His questions were childish by Spiran standards, revealing ignorance of history and doctrine, demonstrating the kind of naive optimism that Spira's harsh realities were meant to crush out of people by adolescence. But childish questions, asked persistently enough, can expose the absurdities that adults have trained themselves not to notice, can reveal that the emperor's clothes are invisible, not because they are made of fabric too fine to see, but because they do not exist at all. Titus's refusal to accept Yuna's coming death as inevitable or necessary planted seeds of doubt in the entire party, made them question whether there might be alternatives to the path that had always been walked, whether tradition was wisdom or merely habit elevated to the status of divine law. Waka, devout in his faith, struggled most visibly with these questions, his belief in Yevon's teachings challenged by accumulating evidence that the Church's doctrine did not align with observed reality. The Al-Baid's use of Machina did not bring sin's attacks. Indeed, sin seemed to attack randomly, without regard for a community's technological sophistication or religious devotion. The Meisters who spoke of purity and sacrifice lived in luxury and comfort, demonstrating through their actions that the humility they preached applied to others but not to themselves. The Crusaders who had attempted Operation Mi'ihin, good people trying to defend their homes, had been condemned as heretics for violating the prohibition on Machina. Yet their sins seemed to be not impiety, but the challenge they represented to church authority. Lulu, cynical and world-weary from having witnessed 2 previous summoners die on their pilgrimages, understood earlier than most that the Church's teachings were meant to maintain order rather than describe truth. She had made her peace with this, accepting that comforting lies might be preferable to unbearable truths, that Spira's people needed hope, even if that hope was false. But watching Yuna, younger, more idealistic, more purely motivated than the summoners Lulu had served before, walk toward the same inevitable sacrifice began to crack Lulu's cynical acceptance, to make her wonder whether preserving the system that demanded such sacrifices was truly serving Spira, or merely serving those who benefited from Spira's perpetual crisis. Auron, the only member of the party who had completed a full pilgrimage before, who had witnessed High Summoner Braska's use of the final summoning and the terrible price it exacted, carried knowledge that he could not fully share, bound by promises and by the complexity of truths that defied simple explanation. He knew that the final summoning required the summoner's death. He knew that it required transforming a guardian into the final Aeon. He knew that defeating sin through this method did not truly end the threat, but merely reset the cycle. And he knew, though he had not fully understood it during Braska's pilgrimage, that there was something deeply wrong with the entire system, something that went beyond individual corruption or institutional hypocrisy to the fundamental purpose sin served and the truth about its creation. Auron had died during Braska's final battle with sin, had become unsent, had persisted in the world through sheer force of will and unfinished purpose, to protect Braska's daughter, to ensure that if she chose to walk the pilgrimage path, she would do so with eyes open to its true cost, to perhaps guide her toward a different ending than the one her father had achieved. His unsent state was itself a violation of Yevon's teachings, making him a heretic by the Church's standards, a wandering soul that should have been sent to the far plane long ago. Yet he persisted because the purpose that drove him, protecting Yuna, exposing the Church's lies, perhaps finding a way to break the cycle that had claimed Braska and so many others, seemed more important than the rest that sending might bring. Kimahri, bound to Yuna through a promise made to her father, approached the pilgrimage with the uncomplicated devotion of someone whose entire identity had become wrapped up in protecting a single person. He did not question the system or the teachings, did not particularly care whether Yevon's doctrine was true or false, cared only that Yuna would be safe, that he would fulfill the duty Braska had entrusted to him. Yet even Kimahri's single-minded focus would be tested as the pilgrimage progressed, as it became clear that protecting Yuna might require not guiding her to the pilgrimage's traditional conclusion, but preventing that conclusion, finding an alternative that the Church insisted did not exist. Riku, Albed, and proud of it, brought to the party an explicit rejection of Yevon's teachings, a perspective formed outside the Church's ideological control. She knew that her people's use of Machina did not cause sin's attacks, that the Church's prohibitions were political tools rather than spiritual necessities. Her brother and father's plan to kidnap summoners before they could complete their pilgrimage, while crude and ultimately ineffective, came from genuine compassion, from the understanding that the pilgrimage served the Church's interests more than Spira's needs. Riku's presence in Yuna's guardian party represented a bridge between Yevon's faithful and those who rejected the faith, a possibility that different perspectives might work together toward a common goal despite fundamental disagreements about doctrine and truth. As the pilgrimage progressed through Spira's temples and shrines, as Yuna collected eons and grew in power, the party encountered evidence of the Church's corruption that became increasingly difficult to dismiss or rationalize. In Luca, they witnessed the Church's political machinations, the way Meisters manipulated events to serve their interests while claiming to serve Yevon. In Macalania, they discovered the Church's secret use of Machina, the hypocrisy at the heart of its most fundamental prohibition. In Bevel itself, they witnessed Seymour's corruption directly, saw a Meister murder his own father and attempt to force Yuna into marriage, using his position and authority to pursue personal power, while cloaking his actions in the language of religious duty. Seymour Guado represented the Church's corruption made manifest, its nihilism stripped of comforting rhetoric. He had gazed into the abyss of Yevon's teachings and found them wanting, had concluded that if the cycle could not be broken, if suffering was eternal, then the merciful act was to end all existence, to use sin's power to kill everyone on Spira and grant them final rest. His plan to marry Yuna, to become her final Aeon, to defeat sin by becoming sin, and then use that power to annihilate all life. This was the logical endpoint of the Church's own premises, the destination toward which 1,000 years of false hope and controlled suffering had been moving. The party's confrontation with Seymour, their witnessing of his murder of Meister Giskel, and their subsequent branding as traitors to Yevon, forced them outside the Church's protection and into direct conflict with the institution that had defined Spiran society for a millennium. They became heretics, not by choice, but by circumstance, by refusing to participate in Seymour's corruption, by choosing to protect Yuna from forced marriage and murder even when doing so meant violating the Church's authority. This exile from Yevon's grace was paradoxically liberating. Once branded as traitors, they were free to question everything, to examine the teachings they had accepted without the internal pressure to maintain faith, to follow evidence and reason wherever it led, regardless of whether it aligned with doctrine. The revelations came in layers, each building upon the last, each more devastating to the Church's credibility and Spira's accepted understanding of reality. In Bevel's depths, they learned the truth about the final summoning, that it required the summoner's death, that it transformed a guardian into the final Aeon, that this had been hidden from summoners and their guardians through carefully managed information control, that the Church had sent countless summoners to their deaths, while knowing they were merely perpetuating the cycle rather than ending it. The Meisters, when confronted, did not deny this truth, but justified it as necessary deception, as a burden of knowledge they bore on behalf of those too weak to understand. Grand Meister Mika's revelation of his own unsent state, his casual acknowledgement that he had remained in the world for decades after his death to maintain power and control, exposed the ultimate hypocrisy, that the Church's leader was himself the very thing the Church condemned, a soul that refused to move on, a violation of the natural cycle that sending was meant to preserve. His justification, that he remained to serve, that his purpose was pure, that he was different from common unsent who became fiends, rang hollow when spoken by someone who clearly clung to power for its own sake, who had transformed the institution meant to guide souls into a mechanism for controlling them. In the Calmlands, approaching Zanarkand's ruins, the party encountered Meister Kelk Ronso's warnings about the truth that waited ahead, hints that what they thought they understood about sin and Yevon was merely the surface of something far more complex and terrible. The Fayth began to communicate more directly, appearing in dreams and visions to Titus and Yuna, speaking of weariness and desire for rest, of being trapped in an eternal cycle they had not fully understood when they volunteered for it, of hoping that this summoner, this pilgrimage, might achieve something different than the endless repetition that had defined the past 1,000 years. At Zanarkand's ruins, the truth finally revealed itself in its completeness, that sin was not divine punishment, but a weapon created by Yu Yevon, that it existed to protect the Dream Zanarkand and the Fayth who sustained it, that defeating it through the final summoning only created a new sin, because the final Aeon itself would become sin's next host, that the cycle was designed to perpetuate itself, that the entire system of pilgrimage and church authority and theological justification was built upon a foundation of deliberate deception and self-perpetuating suffering. The Fayth who spoke to Yuna and Titus in Zanarkand's ruins were desperate, exhausted, pleading for release from their 1,000-year burden of dreaming. They explained what Titus was, a dream person created by their collective vision, dependent on their constant dreaming for his existence. They revealed that Yu Yevon still existed within sin, reduced to pure function, maintaining the armor and guiding the weapon without any remaining trace of the humanity that had created it. And they proposed an alternative to the final summoning, a way to truly defeat sin rather than merely reset the cycle. The party would need to destroy sin's armor, expose Yu Yevon's core consciousness, and defeat Yu Yevon himself, breaking his control over sin and allowing the weapon to finally dissolve. But this alternative came with its own terrible cost. Defeating Yu Yevon would free the Fayth from their burden of dreaming, would allow them to finally rest and move on to the far plane. This was what they wanted, what they desperately needed after 1,000 years of exhausted dreaming. But it also meant that the Dream Zanarkand would cease to exist, would simply dissolve as the dreamers stopped dreaming, and everything and everyone within that dream would dissolve with it. Titus, Yecht, every citizen of Dream Zanarkand, they would all cease to be, not dying in any conventional sense, but simply returning to the nothingness from which they had been summoned. Titus, faced with the knowledge of his own unreality and the certainty of his coming non-existence, had to choose whether to pursue the path that would save Spira but end his own existence, whether the freedom of the Fayth and the breaking of the cycle was worth the price of everyone and everything he had ever known in Dream Zanarkand. It was a choice that echoed the one Yu Yevon had faced 1,000 years before. What sacrifice was acceptable to preserve or save what you loved, but with inverted values. Where Yu Yevon had been willing to condemn Spira to save Zanarkand, Titus would need to accept Zanarkand's dissolution to save Spira. The party's decision to pursue this path, to break the cycle rather than perpetuate it, even though doing so would cost them one of their own, represented a fundamental rejection of the logic that had governed Spira for a millennium. They refused to accept that suffering must be eternal, that the cycle could not be broken, that individuals must be sacrificed to maintain the system. They chose to believe that a better way was possible, even when that way required terrible sacrifice, that breaking free from the pattern was worth whatever price it demanded. The final assault on sin became not merely a battle against a monster, but a confrontation with the entire theological and political structure that had built itself around that monster's existence. Each layer of sin's armor that fell represented another layer of Yevon's lies being stripped away. Each guardian who fought alongside Yuna was rejecting the church's teaching that ordinary people could not challenge sin, that only summoners and their final summoning could achieve even temporary victory. The party's success in penetrating sin's defenses, in reaching the core where Yu Yevon's consciousness resided, proved that the church's doctrine of necessary sacrifice was false, that alternatives existed that had been suppressed not because they were impossible, but because they threatened the system that benefited from impossibility. Within sin, within the twisted interior spaces where gravity and reality bent according to rules that defied physical law, the party encountered the truth of what Yu Yevon had become. There was no personality left, no memory of Zanarkand or love for the city, no recognition of anything beyond the pure function: maintain armor, protect faith, destroy advanced civilization. The battle against Yu Yevon's core was less a fight against a thinking opponent than an attempt to shut down a machine, to interrupt a process that had been running for so long that it had worn grooves into reality itself, to prove that even the most fundamental and long-standing patterns could be broken if one was willing to pay the price. Yecht, who had become the current Sin after serving as Braska's final Aeon a decade prior, retained enough consciousness within Sin to assist in his own defeat, to hold back the weapon's full power long enough for Yuna and her guardians to reach Yu Yevon's core, to choose in his final moments to be more than the instrument of suffering he had been forced to become. His sacrifice, helping to defeat himself, ending his own tortured existence as Sin, was redemption for the arrogance and cruelty that had defined his relationship with his son, proof that even within the most corrupted and controlled system, individual choice and human dignity could assert themselves. When Yu Yevon finally fell, when the consciousness that had animated Sin for 1,000 years was dispersed, and the Fayth were finally freed from their eternal dreaming, the changes rippled across Spira with a speed and completeness that shocked even those who had understood what they were attempting to achieve. Sin dissolved, its massive form breaking apart into fireflies that drifted away on the wind, and for the first time in 1,000 years, Spira's oceans were safe. Its cities could be built without fear of destruction. Its people could plan for futures that extended beyond the next calm. The Dream Zanarkand faded as the Fayth who had maintained it for so long finally moved on to the rest they had earned, and Titus, standing on the deck of an airship with the woman he loved, began to fade with it, his form becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely, returning to the nothing from which he had been dreamed. The immediate aftermath of Sin's permanent defeat was chaos, though chaos of a fundamentally different nature than Spira had experienced for a millennium. This was not the chaos of destruction and fear, of cities razed and populations scattered, but the chaos of freedom granted to people who had spent lifetimes learning to live within very specific constraints, who had internalized limitations so completely that removing those limitations left them disoriented, uncertain how to navigate a world where the old rules no longer applied and new ones had not yet been established. Yevon's church collapsed almost immediately, its authority evaporating the moment it became clear that Sin was truly gone rather than merely dormant, that the cycle had been broken rather than reset. The Meisters, who had justified their power through their claim to understand and manage the Sin threat, found themselves with nothing to manage, their expertise suddenly irrelevant, their theological explanations revealed as the fabrications they had always been. Some, like Mika, chose final rest rather than face a world where they had no place or purpose. Others attempted to maintain their positions, claiming that the church's role would merely evolve to address new challenges. But their efforts found little support among populations that had learned the depth of the deception that had been practiced upon them for generations. The revelation that the church's highest leaders had known the truth about the final summoning, had known they were sending summoners to their deaths to perpetuate a cycle rather than end it, had known about Yu Yevon and the Dream Zanarkand and the true nature of Sin. These discoveries destroyed whatever credibility the institution might have retained. Temples were abandoned or repurposed. Priests who had genuinely believed the teachings they preached found themselves adrift, their faith shattered, their life's work revealed as participation in a system of controlled suffering and deliberate deception. Some descended into nihilism or despair. Others attempted to reconstruct their faith around new principles, to separate the genuine spiritual insights that Yevon's teachings had contained from the political manipulation and theological lies. The hymn of the Fayth, that haunting melody that had been sung in temples and settlements across Spira for 1,000 years, took on new meaning in the aftermath. It had been the song of the Dream Zanarkand's Fayth, their melody, woven into the collective unconscious through centuries of dreaming, becoming something that Spirans recognized without understanding why it moved them so deeply. Now, knowing its origin, the hymn became simultaneously more beautiful and more tragic, a reminder of the souls who had sacrificed everything to preserve something beautiful, who had endured 1,000 years of dreaming so that their city might survive in some form, and who had finally been granted the rest they deserved. The practical challenges of rebuilding Spiran society without the church's infrastructure were immense. Yevon's temples had served as community centers, administrative hubs, sources of justice and education and social organization. Removing the church meant removing much of the institutional framework that had held settlements together, that had provided structure and purpose across generations. New forms of organization needed to emerge. New leaders needed to be identified or elected. New systems of law and governance needed to be developed that could provide stability without relying on religious authority or the threat of divine punishment. The Machina prohibition, revealed as political control rather than spiritual necessity, vanished overnight in some areas and persisted stubbornly in others. Communities that had suffered under the ban eagerly embraced the Al-Baid's technological knowledge, beginning to rebuild some of the capabilities that had existed before Zanarkand and Bevel's war. But other communities, particularly those where Yevon's teachings had taken deepest root, viewed Machina with continued suspicion, unable to immediately overcome centuries of conditioning that had taught them to see such technology as sinful and dangerous. The Al-Baid, no longer persecuted as heretics, found themselves in the strange position of being welcomed as teachers and engineers in some places, while remaining distrusted outsiders in others. Bevel itself faced perhaps the most difficult transition of any Spiran city. It had been the center of Yevon's church, its entire identity wrapped up in religious authority and the administration of the pilgrimage system. With that system gone, with the church discredited, Bevel needed to discover what it could be beyond the institution that had defined it for so long. Some advocated for dismantling the city's power entirely, for decentralizing authority to prevent any single institution from ever again holding the kind of control that Yevon's church had wielded. Others argued for transformation rather than destruction, for maintaining Bevel's role as a coordinating center while fundamentally changing the nature of that coordination from religious diktat to collaborative governance. The question of the unsent became newly complex in Sin's absence. During Yevon's rule, the church had taught that unsent souls were abominations, that they needed to be sent to the far plane immediately to prevent them from becoming fiends. But this teaching had been hypocritical from the start, given that the church's own leaders were unsent, and in the chaos after Yevon's fall, many unsent souls who had been hiding their nature or who had been maintained by church authority despite official doctrine came forward. Some, like Auron, chose to accept sending now that their purposes had been fulfilled. Others argued that they should be allowed to persist if they wished, that the decision of when to move on should belong to the individual rather than be enforced by external authority. Yuna herself, having completed the pilgrimage that ended the cycle rather than perpetuating it, faced a world that no longer had clear use for summoners or for the aeons that summoners had called upon. The Fayth were gone, resting in the far plane, and with them went the ability to summon the aeons that had been fragments of their consciousness. Yuna had succeeded in her stated goal to defeat Sin and bring lasting peace to Spira, but in doing so, she had eliminated the role that had defined her entire life, that had given her purpose and identity. She needed to discover who she was beyond being a summoner, what she could contribute to a world that no longer needed the specific skills and sacrifices that had been her focus for so long. The sphere hunters who emerged in the aftermath of Sin's defeat, individuals who scoured Spira's ruins and abandoned temples for recordings of the past, represented one response to this crisis of purpose and identity. By recovering and disseminating historical records, particularly those the Church had suppressed or distorted, they helped Spirans understand their actual history rather than the sanitized, theologically convenient version that Yevon had taught. These recordings revealed the complexity of the Machina age, showed that it had not been purely decadent or sinful, but had produced genuine achievements and beauty alongside its excesses. They provided evidence of what Zanarkand had actually been like, how different the reality was from the myths that had grown around it over centuries. But sphere hunting also represented a kind of nostalgic escapism, a focus on recovering the past that sometimes came at the expense of building the future. Spira needed to move forward, to create new institutions and new purposes, not merely to understand what had been lost. The balance between learning from history and being trapped by it, between honoring the sacrifices of previous generations and not being defined by those sacrifices, would prove one of the central challenges of post-Sin Spira. The Youth League and Yu Yevon, political movements that emerged in the power vacuum left by the Church's collapse, represented different visions for Spira's future, different answers to the question of how to organize society without the framework that had structured it for a millennium. The Youth League advocated for rapid change, for embracing Machina technology and new forms of governance, for making a clean break with Yevon's legacy and everything it represented. Yu Yevon, despite its name, called for more gradual transformation, for preserving aspects of the old order that had provided stability, even as the Church's deceptions were acknowledged and rejected. Both movements had legitimate points and legitimate blind spots. The Youth League's enthusiasm for change sometimes failed to account for how disorienting rapid transformation could be for populations that had lived their entire lives within Yevon's framework, how destabilizing it was to have every certainty questioned simultaneously. Yu Yevon's caution sometimes served as cover for those who had benefited from the old system and wanted to preserve as much of their privilege as possible, who advocated for gradual change because they hoped gradual would become glacial and eventually stall entirely. The tension between these visions occasionally erupted into violence, conflicts that demonstrated how difficult it was to forge consensus when fundamental premises were in dispute, when people could not agree on basic facts about their world's history or the lessons that should be drawn from that history. Some saw these conflicts as proof that removing Yevon's authority had been a mistake, that the Church, despite its flaws, had at least prevented this kind of internecine struggle. Others argued that the conflicts were growing pains, necessary struggles that would eventually resolve into new and better systems, that the price of freedom was always uncertainty and conflict until new equilibria could be established. The far plane itself, that mysterious realm where the dead gathered before rebirth, began to be understood differently in the absence of Yevon's theological explanations. Without the Church's doctrine to provide authoritative interpretation, Spirans had to confront the reality of death and afterlife more directly, had to develop their own understandings of what the far plane was, whether the images of the dead that appeared there were genuine consciousnesses or merely memories given form by the living's need for connection. Some found this uncertainty liberating, a recognition that ultimate questions might not have definitive answers and that this was acceptable. Others found it terrifying, evidence that removing Yevon had stripped away not just false certainty, but all certainty, leaving nothing but questions and relativism. Yuna's search for Titus, Her refusal to accept that he was simply gone represented both the personal grief of someone who had lost the person she loved and a broader Spiran struggle with the concept of permanent loss. For a millennium, Spirans had lived in a world where loss was temporary, where the departed could be visited in the far plane, where the cycle of rebirth meant that endings were never truly final. The Dream Zanarkand's dissolution, Tidus's return to non-existence, confronted Spira with a form of loss that was absolute, that could not be mediated or softened by theological promises. When Tidus was eventually restored, not through his own effort, but through the collective will of Fayth, who chose to dream him into existence one more time as a gift to Yuna, it raised new questions about the nature of existence, about whether dream people were less real than physically born ones, about what it meant to be, and whether the method of one's creation mattered compared to the consciousness and relationships one developed. The Blitzball stadiums, empty during Sin's era except for small-scale local matches that could be abandoned quickly if the monster appeared, began to fill again as Spirans allowed themselves to invest in entertainment and spectacle, to care about things beyond mere survival. This return to leisure, to the pursuit of beauty and excellence for their own sake, rather than as brief respites from constant threat, was perhaps the most profound indication that Spira had genuinely changed, that the psychological architecture of fear that Sin had created was beginning to dismantle itself. But the trauma of 1,000 years could not be erased in months or even years. An entire world had been shaped by the constant threat of annihilation, had developed cultural practices and individual psychologies adapted to perpetual crisis. Children who grew up during the first years after Sin's defeat struggled to understand what their parents meant when they spoke of the before times, could not fully grasp what it had been like to live, knowing that any moment might bring destruction, that any achievement might be erased before it could bear fruit. And the older generations struggled to adapt to a world where planning for the distant future was actually rational, where building something meant to last centuries was not an exercise in hubris, but a reasonable ambition. The ruins of Zanarkand, no longer patrolled by Sin, no longer forbidden territory, except in the sense that they were dangerous due to fiends and crumbling architecture, became a pilgrimage site of a different kind, not for summoners seeking eons, but for historians and archaeologists attempting to understand what the city had actually been, for artists seeking inspiration in its architecture, for ordinary Spirans trying to connect with a past that had been mythologized beyond recognition. What they found there was both more and less than the myths had suggested. Zanarkand had been advanced and beautiful, but not perfect. It had produced great art and spiritual sophistication, but also the arrogance and cultural competition that had contributed to the war with Bevel. It had been, in other words, a human achievement with all the complexity and contradiction that human achievements always carry. The Fayth's gift of dreaming Tidus back into existence, while motivated by gratitude to Yuna and recognition of her sacrifice, also highlighted an uncomfortable truth, that even without Yu Yevon and without Sin, the power to manipulate reality through collective will still existed, that the line between summoning and playing God remained thin and easily crossed. Some Spirans worried that this represented the seeds of new cycles, new systems of control and manipulation, new ways that power could be concentrated and abused. Others argued that the Fayth's choice demonstrated precisely the opposite, that power wielded consciously, with awareness of its costs and limitations, for specific and limited purposes rather than eternal ones, was qualitatively different from the system Yu Yevon had created. At the heart of Final Fantasy XX's lore lies a meditation on the nature of existence itself, questions that Yu Yevon's desperate act of creation forced upon Spira, but that echo far beyond that particular story, that touch on fundamental human concerns about what is real, what persists, and whether the distinction between dream and reality is as clear as we assume. The Dream Zanarkand challenges our comfortable categories. Its citizens felt real to themselves, experienced joy and sorrow, made choices that seemed meaningful within their context. Were they less real for being dreams? Did their suffering matter less because they would cease to exist when the dreamers stopped dreaming? Titus's existence poses these questions in their most personal form. He was not born, but dreamed, did not have parents in any conventional sense, but was a construct woven from the Fayth's collective memory of what Zanarkand's people had been like. Yet he developed genuine relationships, felt genuine emotions, changed and grew in ways that the script written by the Fayth's memories did not predetermine. His love for Yuna was real in every way that mattered. It shaped his choices, motivated his sacrifices, gave him purpose beyond the narrow parameters of his dream life in Zanarkand. Does the method of his creation diminish the reality of these experiences and relationships? The philosophical tradition that deals with these questions, the nature of consciousness, the relationship between being and being perceived, the status of dreams and simulations, has grappled with them for millennia without reaching definitive answers. Descartes wondered whether everything we experience might be a dream from which we never wake, whether the reality we perceive has any existence independent of our perception. Berkeley argued that to be is to be perceived, that existence consists entirely in being experienced by consciousness. More recently, discussions of simulated consciousness in hypothetical advanced computer systems have asked whether a sufficiently complex simulation would be conscious in the same way that biological entities are conscious, whether there is any meaningful difference between a person and a perfect simulation of a person. Final Fantasy X does not answer these questions definitively. It cannot, because they may not have definitive answers, but it explores them through the specific lens of Yu Yevon's creation and its consequences. The Fayth who dream Zanarkand are real, conscious beings who made real sacrifices and suffer real exhaustion across their centuries of dreaming. The dream they maintain is equally real in its effects. The dream citizens experience real subjective states. The city exists in some form, even if that form is unconventional. The question is not whether the dream is real in some absolute sense, but what we mean by reality, what criteria we use to distinguish between existence and non-existence, and whether those criteria are as reliable as we assume. Yu Yevon's transformation into pure function, into consciousness so reduced and focused that it no longer resembles anything we would recognize as a person, raises related questions about the persistence of identity across radical change. Is the thing within sin that maintains the armor and guides the weapon still Yu Yevon? It carries forward his purpose, executes the plan he created, serves the function he designed himself to serve. But it has lost everything that made Yu Yevon an individual. His memories, his personality, his ability to reflect on his choices or change his mind. It is less a person than a process, a pattern running on spiritual hardware, and yet it is what Yu Yevon chose to become, the logical endpoint of his willingness to sacrifice everything for Zanarkand's survival. This transformation echoes a thought experiment common in discussions of personal identity and consciousness. If you gradually replaced parts of your brain with functionally identical artificial components, at what point, if any, would you cease to be you? If the replacement preserved all your memories and behavioral patterns, but operated on different substrate, would the result still be you or merely a copy that behaved like you? Yu Yevon represents an extreme version of this scenario. He replaced not just substrate, but purpose, stripping away everything except the bare minimum required to execute a single function, and what remained was technically continuous with what he had been, but so transformed that calling it the same person seems to stretch the concept beyond usefulness. The Fayth's eventual desire for release, their exhaustion after centuries of dreaming, suggests that even existence outside normal time, even consciousness that experiences all moments simultaneously rather than sequentially, is still subject to something like fatigue, to a degradation of the will to persist. They do not age in conventional terms. Their statues do not decay. Their ability to dream does not diminish through simple passage of time. But the effort of maintaining focus across centuries, of holding the same vision without variation or rest, accumulates a different kind of burden, a weariness of purpose rather than body. This suggests that consciousness, regardless of the form it takes, requires change and variation to remain sustainable, that existence without growth or development is a form of torture, even when that existence serves a purpose the consciousness originally endorsed. The question of whether the Fayth's original consent to become eternal dreamers remains ethically binding across centuries touches on issues of autonomy and the limits of self-determination. They chose to become Fayth, understanding that they were giving up their individual existence to serve Zanarkand's preservation. But they could not have fully understood what 1,000 years of dreaming would feel like, could not have anticipated the exhaustion that would eventually make their sacrifice feel like imprisonment. At what point does a commitment made in one context become void because the context has changed so radically that the original choice can no longer be considered informed? Can one consent to eternal service, or does consent require the possibility of reconsideration, the option to change one's mind when circumstances change or new information becomes available? The dream, Zanarkand's perfection, its existence in eternal stasis, never changing, never growing, never subject to decay or development, is simultaneously its beauty and its tragedy. It preserves Zanarkand exactly as it was in its final golden moment, a snapshot of cultural achievement frozen in time. But this preservation comes at the cost of life in any meaningful sense, because life requires change, requires the possibility of both progress and loss, requires mortality and uncertainty and all the things that the dream explicitly excludes. The dream's citizens live their lives in loops, never learning anything they did not already know, never experiencing anything genuinely new, trapped in patterns as surely as the Fayth are trapped in their dreaming. This raises the question of whether preservation without change is actually preservation at all, or whether it is a form of death wearing the mask of life. Zanarkand's culture was valuable not just because of what it produced, but because of its capacity to continue producing, to evolve and develop, to respond to new challenges and opportunities. The Dream Zanarkand preserves the products, the architecture, the art, the blitzball games, but not the capacity, not the living tradition that created those things. It is a museum exhibit, not a civilization, a recording rather than a performance. And there is a fundamental difference between those states even when the external appearance is identical. Yu Yevon's act of creation, viewed in this light, was not preservation, but transformation, not salvation, but fossilization. He saved the form of Zanarkand while killing its essence, maintained the appearance of life while ensuring that actual life, with all its messy uncertainty and possibility, could never exist within his creation. And in doing so, he condemned not just Zanarkand's dream citizens to this half-existence, but the Fayth themselves, who traded life for the endless maintenance of a simulation, who gave up their own possibility of growth and change to maintain the illusion of growth and change in others. The irony, of course, is that real Zanarkand, the physical city that existed before the war, was itself impermanent, subject to change and eventual destruction, regardless of Yu Yevon's intervention. Cities rise and fall, cultures evolve or disappear. Even the greatest achievements eventually crumble or are forgotten. This is not tragedy, but simply the nature of existence in a universe governed by entropy, where nothing lasts forever and the impermanence of all things is the price we pay for the possibility of change and novelty. Yu Yevon's refusal to accept this, his attempt to make Zanarkand eternal through the dream, represented a kind of cosmic hubris, the belief that he could exempt something he loved from the universal law that all things pass. But perhaps the greatest tragedy of Yu Yevon's creation was not what it did to Zanarkand or to the Fayth, but what it prevented: the natural evolution of civilization on Spira, the possibility that something new and different and equally valuable might emerge from the ashes of the Machina age. By creating sin to prevent advanced civilization from developing, Yu Yevon ensured that Spira would remain locked in a state of permanent crisis, unable to progress, unable to develop the kinds of institutions and knowledge bases that might eventually have found alternatives to the cycles of conflict that had destroyed Zanarkand and Bevel. He preserved one dead civilization at the cost of preventing all future civilizations, maintained one frozen moment of beauty, while ensuring that beauty could never again flourish in any living form. The resolution of Final Fantasy XII's story, the breaking of the cycle, the release of the Fayth, the dissolution of the Dream Zanarkand, represents a choice to embrace impermanence, to accept that loss is inevitable, and that attempting to prevent it through extreme measures causes more suffering than it prevents. Yuna's decision to pursue the path that would end the dream, knowing it would cost her Titus, paralleled the choice that Yu Yevon had failed to make: to let go, to accept that what we love will eventually be lost, that this is the price of existence in time rather than in eternal stasis. Titus's eventual return, the Fayth's decision to dream him back as a gift to Yuna, complicates this resolution, but does not entirely undermine it. The difference between Titus's second existence and the original Dream Zanarkand is that his return is limited, specific, chosen consciously rather than imposed as eternal obligation. The Fayth dream him for a time, but not forever, and he exists knowing his own contingency, understanding that he persists at the sufferance of those who dream him, and that this dream could end. This awareness of contingency, paradoxically, makes his existence more real than it was in the original dream, where he believed himself to be permanent and independent when he was actually neither. The question of what endures when everything else fades, what survives the dissolution of cities and the ending of dreams, is answered in Final Fantasy X through memory and story. Zanarkand, the city is gone. Zanarkand, the dream has dissolved. But Zanarkand as an idea, as a symbol of what human civilization can achieve when it pursues beauty and grace and spiritual refinement, persists in the minds of those who learned its story. The hymn of the Fayth continues to be sung even after the Fayth themselves have moved on. The lessons of Yu Yevon's mistake, the dangers of refusing to accept loss, the folly of attempting to preserve through force what should be allowed to naturally evolve or end, shape Spira's future, even as the specifics of his story fade into history. This is the answer to Yu Yevon's desperate question, the one he never consciously asked, but that drove all his actions. How do we preserve what we love in the face of inevitable loss? We do not preserve it through force or through refusing to let it change. We preserve it through story, through memory, through allowing what was valuable in the past to inform the present without dictating it, through carrying forward the best of what came before while releasing what no longer serves. Zanarkand endures, not as a frozen dream, but as an inspiration, not as an eternal monument, but as a reminder of what is possible. And this form of endurance is both more honest and more valuable than the false immortality Yu Yevon tried to impose. Yu Yevon's legacy is written in the scars he left across Spira, in the generations who lived and died, knowing only fear, in the civilizational development that was prevented, in the countless lives sacrificed to maintain a system designed to perpetuate rather than solve the crisis at its heart. For 1,000 years, his name was invoked in temples and prayers, worshipped by people who had no idea who he really was or what he had actually done, transformed by Yevon's church into a symbol that bore no resemblance to the reality. He became whatever the church needed him to be: prophet, martyr, divine instrument, everything except what he actually was: a man who loved his city so much that he destroyed the world to save it, who sacrificed his humanity to protect a dream, who created eternal suffering in the name of preserving beauty. The transformation of Yu Yevon's actual story into Yevon's theological doctrine represents perhaps the most complete historical revisionism ever achieved. A rewriting so thorough that the truth became literally unimaginable to most Spirans, who could not conceive that their entire cosmology was based on one man's desperate act rather than divine will or cosmic punishment. The church took his creation and inverted its meaning, transformed a weapon of protection into proof of divine judgment, reframed the tool of preservation as instrument of atonement, built an entire civilization's moral framework around a foundation that was not merely false, but backwards. This inversion served the church's purposes perfectly, but it also created a tragic irony. Yu Yevon was condemned by a religion that bore his name, blamed for sins he did not commit, while his actual sins went unacknowledged. The church taught that Yu Yevon understood humanity's pride and created sin as punishment, when in fact his creation of sin was itself the ultimate act of pride, the refusal to accept that what he loved could be allowed to end naturally, the insistence that his will could override the basic patterns of existence itself. He was guilty not of humility, but of hubris, not of recognizing humanity's failings, but of embodying them in their most extreme form. The question of whether Yu Yevon should be viewed as villain or tragic figure, whether his actions deserve condemnation or compassion, does not have a simple answer, and perhaps should not have one. He committed terrible acts, created a weapon that caused suffering on a civilizational scale, condemned countless innocents to death and fear, imprisoned 10,000 souls in eternal dreaming to serve his purpose. These are not minor failings that can be excused through understanding his motivations. The suffering he caused was real. The damage he did persisted for a millennium. And the fact that he acted from love rather than malice does not erase or diminish that harm. Yet viewing him as simply monstrous, as evil incarnate, or as corruption personified, misses something essential about his story and the warnings it carries. Yu Yevon was not fundamentally different from other people, was not born with some unique capacity for evil that set him apart from common humanity. He was exceptional in his abilities, in his mastery of summoning, and his understanding of the faith. But the moral failing that led to his terrible choice, the refusal to accept loss, the willingness to cause suffering to prevent suffering, the belief that his love justified any action, these are common human failings, merely expressed at a scale that his power made possible. This is what makes his story both tragic and cautionary. Tragedy requires that the protagonist's downfall emerge from their own choices, from qualities that might in other circumstances be virtues, but that in the specific context lead to disaster. Yu Yevon's love for Zanarkand, his loyalty to his people, his refusal to give up when others would have accepted defeat, these could have been admirable qualities. They became monstrous only when pushed past all reasonable limits, when love became obsession, when loyalty became fanaticism, when refusal to surrender became refusal to accept reality. The cautionary aspect lies in recognizing how easily this transformation can occur, how small the steps are from reasonable devotion to destructive obsession, from acceptable sacrifice to unacceptable harm. Yu Yevon did not wake up one morning and decide to torture a world for 1,000 years. He took a series of steps, each seemingly justified by the one before, each incrementally increasing the scope of his commitment until he had gone so far that turning back seemed impossible, until the sunk costs of what he had already sacrificed demanded that he continue sacrificing. This pattern, incremental escalation, each step seeming necessary to protect the investments made in previous steps, until one has committed atrocities that would have seemed unthinkable at the journey's beginning, is not unique to Yu Yevon. It recurs throughout history in individuals and societies who begin with understandable goals and end in horror, who cross lines they swore they would never cross because the alternative seems to be admitting that everything they have already done was for nothing. Recognizing this pattern, understanding how it operates and how to resist it, is perhaps the most valuable lesson that Yu Yevon's story offers. The fact that Yu Yevon himself no longer existed in any meaningful sense to face judgment or learn from his mistakes adds another layer of tragedy to his story. By the time Spira had endured 1,000 years of suffering, by the time the consequences of his actions had become fully clear, there was no one left to hold accountable in any conventional sense. The consciousness within sin was not capable of guilt or regret, could not be reasoned with or punished, could not choose differently because choice itself had been sacrificed, along with everything else that made Yu Yevon human. Justice, in the sense of the perpetrator facing consequences and potentially learning from them, was impossible because the perpetrator no longer existed as a moral agent. This raises uncomfortable questions about accountability and punishment, when the entity that committed wrongs has fundamentally changed or no longer exists. Defeating Yu Yevon within sin's core was necessary to break the cycle, but it was not punishment in any meaningful sense. It was more like shutting down a malfunctioning machine than defeating a person. The vengeance that survivors of sin's attacks might have wanted to visit upon sin's creator could not be satisfied because there was no one left to receive it, no consciousness capable of understanding what it had done or suffering appropriately for it. The Fayth who had enabled Yu Yevon's plan through their voluntary transformation faced a different kind of accountability. They had chosen to become Fayth, had participated in the creation of both the Dream Zanarkand and sin, and they remained conscious and capable of understanding the consequences of those choices across the centuries. Yet they were also victims, trapped in a role they could no longer escape, suffering from a commitment that had seemed noble when made, but that time had transformed into torture. Their desire for release was legitimate, yet granting that release meant ending the Dream Zanarkand and everyone within it, imposing on the Dream citizens a cost they had not chosen and could not consent to. This highlights the complexity of moral responsibility in systems where individual choices create collective outcomes that no single participant fully intended or controlled. The Fayth as individuals had made reasonable choices based on the information available to them. Yu Yevon had designed the system and convince them to participate. But the system's persistence and its terrible effects emerge from the interaction of these choices, from the way individual decisions combined into patterns that took on a life of their own, that became self-perpetuating and self-justifying in ways that transcended any single participant's intent or control. Breaking such systems requires recognition that collective responsibility is not merely the sum of individual responsibilities, that dismantling structures of harm often requires actions that would seem unfair if judged purely at the individual level. The Fayth had to be released, even though they were partially victims. The Dream Zanarkand had to be dissolved, even though its citizens were entirely innocent. These were not just outcomes, but necessary means to the end of breaking the cycle. And accepting that necessity required acknowledging that sometimes there are no perfectly fair solutions, that the least harmful option still causes harm, that choosing who suffers when suffering cannot be entirely avoided is itself a form of terrible responsibility. Yu Yevon's story ultimately asks whether the ends can ever justify the means, whether causing suffering to prevent suffering can ever be morally acceptable, and if so, what limits should govern such calculations? His answer, that preserving Zanarkand justified any cost, any suffering, imposed on anyone for any duration, was clearly wrong, pushed past any reasonable boundary, became evil regardless of the purity of the motivating love. But rejecting his extreme position does not automatically answer the underlying question, does not tell us where the line should be drawn between acceptable and unacceptable sacrifice, between justified and unjustified imposition of costs on others. The pilgrims who completed the journey and performed the final summoning faced similar moral questions in smaller scale. They chose to sacrifice themselves to buy Spira a few years of peace, knowing that their sacrifice would not permanently solve the problem, but would provide temporary relief. Were they right to make this choice? The Church presented it as noble, as the highest form of service, and there was genuine nobility in the willingness to give everything for others' benefit. But they were also participating in a system that was designed to perpetuate itself, that used their sacrifices to maintain the cycle rather than break it, that transformed their deaths into tools for controlling populations and preserving institutional authority. The distinction between their situation and Yu Yevon's is that they were working within constraints not of their making, responding to a crisis they did not create, while Yu Yevon created the crisis itself. The summoners who walked the pilgrimage bore responsibility only for their own choices within impossible circumstances, while Yu Yevon bore responsibility for creating those circumstances. Yet the parallel remains. Both chose to impose costs on themselves primarily, but on others secondarily, to preserve or protect something they valued, and both participated in cycles of suffering that lasted far longer than they anticipated or intended. Yu Yevon's final legacy may be the questions he forces us to confront about love and loss, about what we are willing to do to preserve what we value, about the point at which devotion becomes destruction and protection becomes imprisonment. He loved Zanarkand completely, and that love drove him to ensure its survival by any means necessary. But love without wisdom, without humility, without acceptance of limits, becomes a destructive force regardless of its origins. The capacity to love deeply is precious and essential, but it must be balanced by the capacity to let go, to accept that what we love will change and eventually end, that this is not failure, but simply the nature of existence in time. The Dream Zanarkand that Yu Yevon preserved was perfect in its way, unchanging and beautiful, a crystallized moment of cultural achievement. But it was also dead, frozen. incapable of growth or authentic life. Real Zanarkand, the living city that existed before the war, was imperfect and vulnerable to destruction, but it was alive in ways that the dream could never be. In choosing the dream over acceptance of loss, Yu Yevon chose a beautiful corpse over an imperfect but living tradition, chose preservation over transformation, chose to stop time rather than accept its passage. The people of Spira, after sin's defeat, faced the inverse choice: to accept loss, of Titus, of the Dream Zanarkand, of the familiar structures that had governed their lives, in order to gain freedom from the cycle, from fear, from the limitations that perpetual crisis had imposed. Their choice to accept these losses, painful as they were, represented the wisdom that Yu Yevon lacked, that growth requires death, that new life emerges only when old forms are allowed to end, that clinging to what was prevents the emergence of what could be. In the ruins of Zanarkand, where this story began, where a city's ghost was dreamed into half-existence by souls who gave up their individual futures to preserve a collective past, there is now silence where once there was the endless cycle of dream citizens living their scripted lives. The Fayth have moved on, finally granted the rest they earned through 1,000 years of exhausted dreaming. The dream has dissolved, returning to the nothing from which it was summoned. The towers that once stood in eternal golden afternoon now stand only in memory and in the physical ruins that outlasted the dream they inspired, crumbling stones that speak of glory and hubris in equal measure. Sin is gone from Spira's oceans, dissolved into pyroflies that drifted away on winds that no longer carry the promise of destruction. The weapon that Yu Yevon created to protect his dream, that he transformed himself into piloting, that became Spira's defining reality for a millennium, has been unmade not through the final summoning that would have perpetuated its cycle, but through direct confrontation with its core, through the willingness of people who had suffered under it to face it honestly and end it permanently regardless of the cost. Yu Yevon himself, the summoner who became something less than human in his attempt to preserve something more than human, exists now only in the stories told about him, in the cautionary tales of what love without wisdom becomes, in the questions his choices force upon those who learn his true history. The man who lived is gone. The ghost that piloted sin is dispersed. What remains is the lesson, the pattern to recognize and avoid, the understanding that the greatest harms often emerge not from malice, but from virtues pushed past their proper limits, from love that refuses to accept loss, from devotion that demands eternity. The spiral that gave Spira its name, that symbolized the cycle of death and rebirth that sin's existence had enforced, has been broken, but not eliminated. Life continues to follow patterns. Beings are born, live, die, and in some form continue. But these patterns are now natural rather than imposed, chosen rather than enforced, subject to variation and evolution rather than locked into rigid recursion. The spiral has become a path rather than a prison, movement through time rather than repetition of it, growth rather than stasis. Yevon's church, built on the foundation of Yu Yevon's name, but bearing no resemblance to his actual purposes or beliefs, has collapsed under the weight of its accumulated lies, its power dissolved by revelations that destroyed its credibility beyond recovery. New institutions will emerge to fill the void it left, some better, some worse, all imperfect in their own ways, because perfection is not available to human endeavors, because any institution is only as good as the people who compose it and the constraints under which it operates. The hope is not that these new institutions will be perfect, but that they will be honest, that they will not build themselves on foundations of deliberate deception, that they will maintain enough humility to change when change is needed. The summoners, whose art was transformed by Yevon's church from spiritual communion into sacrificial pilgrimage, must find new purposes now that the Fayth are gone and the need to defeat sin no longer drives their calling. Some will discover that summoning was merely a means to serve, that their true purpose was always to help others, and that this can take many forms beyond calling eons. Others will mourn the loss of the tradition that defined them, will struggle to find new identities in a world that has been fundamentally changed. Both responses are valid, both are human, and both will contribute to the slow, difficult, necessary work of building a Spira that can sustain hope without requiring endless sacrifice. The Machina that hum in workshops and cities across Spira, no longer forbidden, no longer treated as evidence of sinful pride, represent both genuine progress and genuine danger. The technology that allows rapid communication and travel, that makes some forms of labor less dangerous and more efficient, that expands the boundaries of what human effort can achieve. This is valuable, worth developing, worth celebrating. But the history of Zanarkand and Beveli's war, the understanding that technological advancement can be turned to destructive purposes, that power without wisdom leads to catastrophe. These lessons must not be forgotten in the enthusiasm for rebuilding what was lost during Sin's millennium. The balance between remembering and moving forward, between honoring the past and not being imprisoned by it, between learning from history and not being defined by it. This balance will be Spira's challenge in the generations to come. Yu Yevon's mistake was choosing memory over life, preservation over transformation, refusing to accept that what we love must be allowed to change and eventually end if it is to have been truly alive. Spira's task is to remember that mistake without repeating it, to honor what was valuable in the past while remaining open to futures that differ from anything that came before. Titus, the dream boy who became real through the relationships he forged and the choices he made, who existed in the space between dream and reality and proved that the distinction mattered less than the connections formed across it, represents the possibility of meaning in contingency, of value in impermanence, of love that endures not through refusing to end, but through accepting that ending is inevitable and loving anyway, fully, without reservation or protection. His return, temporary and conditional, demonstrates that some dreams deserve to be dreamed again, not forever, but for a time, not as eternal monuments, but as gifts given freely and accepted with gratitude for whatever duration they last. This is perhaps the final answer to Yu Yevon's question, the response his 1,000-year curse was meant to prevent, that we preserve what we love not by making it eternal, but by allowing it to live fully, even knowing that life means eventual loss, that we honor what has ended not by refusing to let it go, but by carrying forward what was best in it while releasing what no longer serves. In the spirals turning, in the cycles breaking, in the dreams ending and the new days beginning, there is sorrow for what is lost and hope for what might be built from the ruins. Zanarkand is gone, but not forgotten. Yu Yevon's consciousness is dispersed, but his story persists. Sin is defeated, but the capacity for similar mistakes remains, waiting in the hearts of anyone who loves so deeply that they forget wisdom, who fears loss so completely that they choose eternal preservation over authentic life. This is the lore of Final Fantasy X, the story of Yu Yevon's cycle of death and rebirth, of the summoner who became a weapon, of the dream that became a prison, of the 1,000 years of suffering required to finally understand that some things must be allowed to end so that other things can begin, that love must be balanced by acceptance, that beauty means nothing if it cannot change, and that hope lies not in eternal preservation, but in the willingness to let go. to move forward, to build anew on foundations that acknowledge both the achievements and the mistakes of everything that came before. The hymn of the Fayth plays one last time, not in temples or from dream throats, but in memory, a reminder of souls who dreamed and finally rest, of a city that was beautiful enough to inspire 1,000 years of dreaming, of a love that became corruption, and a corruption that was finally cleansed not through punishment, but through release, not through vengeance, but through understanding, not through the continuation of cycles, but through their ending. And in that ending, Spira finds its beginning.